who you really are does matter. And I'm so sorry this it didn't have to happen. I'm so sorry it happened. You don't deserve this. And I'm sorry. I'll do everything I can to help make the world better and like what I thought it was.
This is the 7th and final installment of a 7-part retrospective looking back on BBC Sherlock and TJLC. It is intended that you watch the entire series in order. Hey, listen. Are you listening? Good. If you're starting with this one, this is me begging you. Please start at the beginning. This video only fully makes sense in context of the rest of the retrospective. There's an annotation in the top right corner for the full playlist. I'll see you back here in several hours. Even with my pleading, I know some people are going to watch this video on its own. So I want to start this video by making it clear that I'm approaching this discussion very differently than I was 5 years ago, even without the rest of the retrospective as context. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's not a pleasant one. In fact, I'm telling it to you to see if I can upset you with it. It's not gory or graphic or anything like that. It's just worse. I'm going to tell you the story of a hypothetical future of BBC Sherlock. Against the odds, this year, next year, in 2024, in 2027, Mark and Stephen announce a Series 5 of BBC Sherlock, admitting that it had been in the works for years, and they advise viewers to question everything they think they know. During Setlock, Andrew Scott and Amanda Abington are both seen together, and there's no child actor in sight. The excitement is palpable. In the lead up to its release, the writers admit that this will be the final series, genuinely this time, that they have at last said everything they want to say about these characters. The first episode airs, and it begins with John in the house he shared with Mary. Sherlock rings the bell, Molly in tow, to invite him on a case. Molly, of course, is there to watch Rosie, and so the adventures continue. The bit with Mary and Moriarty together turns out to be a nightmare John was describing to Sherlock. They both laugh at the absurdity of that situation. But eventually, they come across a case that Sherlock can't solve. There's only one mind brilliant enough for it: Emrys. But Emrys hasn't spoken in years. John has an idea and asks Sherlock to sneak a phone into Sharonford. He does, but after returning, begins acting distantly towards John. Emrys and John begin texting, connecting just like they did in The Six Thatchers. There's an easy understanding there. They can both share pieces of themselves that they can't with anyone else. Eventually, Emrys solves the case, but in the aftermath, John realizes that Sherlock has disappeared. In episode 2, John begins trying to convince Mycroft it's safe to release Emrys, while also making an obligatory effort to locate Sherlock. Eventually, he accomplishes both by convincing Mycroft that Emrys is the only one who can find Sherlock. Emrys locates him immediately, but refuses to tell anyone where he is, instead setting up the answer in an elaborate puzzle. Mycroft and John don't solve it, but eventually Sherlock returns on his own. He finds John, and his entire demeanor has changed. He seems almost on the verge of tears. He says he has something he has to tell John, a confession that will change everything. John admits that he has something he needs to get off his chest, too. They blurt it out at the same time. John is in love with Emrys, and Sherlock is in love with Irene Adler, who he had connected with while he was away. They both laugh and congratulate each other. Sherlock jokes about John taking care of his little sister. The final episode is John and Sherlock making one last attempt to solve a case together, one based on the adventure of the retired colorman. But neither of their hearts are in it anymore. Sherlock is the one to admit it first, that their time together has drawn to a close. John couldn't agree more. And so the two do solve the case, for old time's sake, and then Sherlock leaves London to travel the world with Irene Adler. Finally, an adventure and a companion mad enough to satisfy and fulfill him. Meanwhile, John and Emrys continue to solve crimes together. Emrys and John both move into Baker Street, and in some ways, she completely takes Sherlock's place in John's life. The show ends with Mycroft remarking that John was the making of his brother, in a way, just as Sherlock was the making of John. But now, at last, they have grown past their need for each other. Their story will always live on, but only as a fond memory. That is my worst-case scenario for the future of BBC Sherlock. I would vastly prefer that Sherlock never air again than anything remotely like that happen. And I admit, I have spent months refining that story, and I've made it as horrible as I possibly can while still leaving it remotely plausible. New Sherlock might not be as bad as all of that, even without TJLC. It might be a return to wink and a nod subtext. It could be more like Dracula. Sherlock and John might platonically raise a child together and move to Sussex to keep bees. I would be fine with any of those scenarios. And in some ways, after spending so long thinking of that worst case scenario, any of those would be a relief. But this is the story that I have been telling myself as I work on this project. And I ask myself, if that happens, if Series 5 comes out, and it is everything I would hate most, would I do anything differently now? I want to be sure that the answer is no. And I think it is. Even if that version comes to fruition, I think I would still be happy with this project. I have made this retrospective in light of that possibility as much as I can. I have been careful with myself, and I have been careful with you. And that's why I'm telling you this story, to ask you the same question. If you knew that Series 5 was going to be as bad as all of that, would you do anything differently? Would you still watch this video? If you think you would have regrets, I encourage you to act in light of them. And I really want to push you on this. And so, in addition to that horrifying hypothetical future, I'm going to dredge up the worst of the past, the most discouraging Moftus quote of which I am aware. It is infuriating, frankly, to be talking about a serious subject and to have Twitter run around and say, oh, that means Sherlock is gay. Very explicitly, it does not. We are taking a serious subject and trivializing it beyond endurance. It's worth saying, because we never get the opportunity to actually say it, the whole notion, the idea of them possibly being a couple, is inspired by the joke in the Billy Wilder film The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, our favorite version, and we thought that was a good idea to run with that. In the 21st century, it wouldn't be an issue. People would just assume. Maybe we've done it too many times. I don't know. That's all it is. He explicitly says he's not interested. Doesn't mean he couldn't be. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. I'm a gay man. This is not an issue. But we've explicitly said this is not going to happen. There is no game plan, no matter how much we lie about other things, that this show is going to culminate in Martin and Benedict going off into the sunset together. They are not going to do it. And if people want to write whatever they like and have a great time extrapolating, that's absolutely fine. But there is no hidden or exposed agenda. We're not trying to fuck with people's heads, not trying to insult anybody or make any kind of issue out of it. There's nothing there. It's our show, and that's what these characters are like. If people want to do that on websites, that's absolutely fine, but there's nothing there. No, completely. Don't blame us for things that aren't there. It is infuriating. We get pilloried for these things as if our show, we haven't even made the 13th one yet, has to have the shoulders to bear every single issue and every single campaign point. You can't do that. It's our show. There are characters. They do what we want them to do, and we don't have to represent absolutely everything in 90 minutes. It's impossible, and it would kill it. It would be deadly to it. And I also think, in my case, I was talking about representation, as was Brian, in a quite serious way. What they did was scale back that conversation and make it about something extremely silly, and that's not helping anyone. I cared a lot about what I said on that panel. I meant it, and I don't like it being reinterpreted as something else. We're not telling anyone what to think. Mark isn't saying that other people can't write that version of John and Sherlock getting together. We're not. We're not engaging in a clever conspiracy to write something under the radar. We're just writing the show we're writing. That's not the story we're telling, but they can. They can. Once we hand the show to them and it's theirs and we're finished with it, they can do what they like. Thank you, Stephen. I have and I am. I told you it was my most discouraging. Now, I could pick that apart and find hope in it. And I mean that. I could. Like how Mark is presenting the idea that they would possibly end their story with a couple holding hands into the sunset as completely absurd when, if you're watching this in order like you're meant to, you know that they have now ended a show with, well...
After all this time, did you think I'd let it hurt?
And I bring that up to bring you back from the brink in case that quote made you start spiraling. But I don't want you to focus on that. I want you to focus on what they said and seriously consider the possibility that they're telling you the truth. There is no clever conspiracy, no game plan, no agenda. They aren't trying to fuck with people's heads. It's just not the story they're telling, and it never will be. If you knew that was true, would you do anything differently? When I made the first 48 episodes of TJLC Explained, I was convinced I had it right, and I made every effort to convince my audience of the same. If you didn't believe me after one video, get ready. The next one would get you to believe. And I regret that approach so much. I see that as the fundamental flaw of my work looking back on it now, leaving no room for the possibility that I was wrong, and actively working to get rid of any doubt that my audience might be holding on to as well. This time, I'm going into this video with my eyes wide open. I know that I don't know, and I'm openly admitting that to all of you. What I've discovered is that I don't need to be right for this analysis to be rewarding to me. Like Holmes, I'm content to play the game for the game's own sake. I don't need to win. And in many ways, I've made this project under the assumption that I've already lost, and I'm okay with that. If the same isn't true for you, I'd ask you to take a long moment of reflection before continuing on. Be careful with your heart. It is not worth breaking it over a TV show, especially when there are so many other versions of these characters, and there will be countless more. Regardless of what BBC Sherlock does, someone, someday, is going to tell that story. You don't need to put all of your hope in this version. All of that said, once we enter into this video properly, I am going to approach the discussion as if TJLC is correct. Because if there is a game plan, that raises its own set of concerns, and I want to address those, and I can't effectively discuss those ideas while constantly interrupting myself to say that the entire conversation might be fruitless. It very well might be, but bringing it up constantly would be counterproductive and get repetitive very quickly. And so, like so many Sherlock Holmes fans before me, I'm going to be playing the game. The only difference is that I'm applying it to a different text. To do that, I'll be treating the ideas that I've been mentioning throughout this series, that BBC Sherlock is, at its core, an argument about the home stories, that the show asks questions about the nature of those stories to lead to one final answer, that the show uses satire to make its points, that the writers are deliberately presenting contradictory information about the characters and the themes as a way of playing the game with their audience, as if they're all true. And if they are, Series 4 was actually fairly well telegraphed from the start. We're going to talk about that too. But again, I ask you to keep in mind that at the end of the day, this is only a theory about a TV show, and a theory with a very inconsistent record. We did get The Abominable Bride right, but we got Series 4 very wrong. If the thought of this theory being wrong again stresses you out, maybe don't watch this video. I'm opening the hatch and parachutes are available, but seriously, this is your last chance to duck out. Now, this doesn't have to be a topic with life or death stakes. In fact, it shouldn't be one. It should be light and fun. That's something I hoped I would be able to discover in coming back to this. A better way to engage with TJLC, and I've found it. When you aren't betting all you have on the outcome, TJLC can be a fun game, even in light of Series 4 and the issues I have with it. And that's what I want to demonstrate here. So, without further ado, after 6 videos and 5 years of waiting, hello everyone, my name is Rebecca, or Rebs for short, and welcome back to...
Okay, I gotta take this thing off. It doesn't feel right.
You're gambling with your own life.
Why not? It's so much more exciting than gambling with others.
While my ultimate goal with this retrospective is to make peace with this show and to provide you all with the framework you need to do the same, there is one question that is the subtext behind everything I have said. A question that casts a foreboding shadow over everything else relating to this show. Were the things that appeared to be clever and intentional on BBC Sherlock, the intricately woven subtext with John and Sherlock's relationship, the hints of a grander plan unfolding behind the scenes, actually clever and intentional, or was it all a trick of the lighting? I think you can love our version of the story either way, but I want to explain why the former still seems like a reasonable conclusion to come to, even as I encourage you not to make yourselves convinced of it. There are 2 experiences that I have had since coming back that have shaped the way that I approach that question now. Watching BBC Dracula and writing from a drop of water. You already know how Dracula has completely changed the way I watch Sherlock, but it was actually writing from a drop of water that had the bigger impact. When I originally made TJLC Explained, I had never written any kind of fiction. I was approaching the work purely from my background in literary analysis. I didn't have any experience on the other side of things. And what I learned very quickly while working on the other side of things is that writing does not happen by accident. Every choice, every plot point, every detail, sometimes every last specific word is there for a reason, and usually there for 2 or 3 or 5. Now you might say that's just because I'm a more careful writer than Mark and Stephen are, and as much as I appreciate the compliment, I find that very hard to believe. I don't want to sell myself short or put them on a pedestal. I think I'm a decent writer, and I think their work has flaws. But From a Drop of Water was my first story, and I find it extremely unlikely that I am somehow leagues more attentive and thoughtful than people who have been doing this for decades. And the argument gets even weaker when you consider how much more work it is to create a TV show. Not only do you have to write the story, but then you have dozens of people all working together to realize that vision, having countless conversations about every last detail. Something like the choice to make it look like Sherlock is being burned alive as he plays John and Mary's wedding song, when other angles show the closest candles were actually quite far away, the way the window panes make the shadow of the cross on Dracula as he finally steps into the sunlight, where Sherlock's chessboard is located for each scene of Baker Street, and how prominent it is in each shot, those things are all happening on purpose. That's not to say that every writer writes with symbolism and theme in mind first. I don't think they do. I think the best indicator of that is what you prioritize as an audience member. Obsessed with picking over details when you read or watch something, you're going to be hardwired to do the same when you finally get around to writing. So if you're a reader who looks at your favorite work of fiction, which is full of apparent contradictions and seeming mistakes, and say this, and there are those details throughout it. Doyle, despite what people tended to say about him, didn't do anything by accident. These are all very deliberate, cleverly written stories, albeit at the same speed, and the fact that it is a friendship is intentional. But there's that one moment of total affection between them that happens once and is never repeated, and it's there for a purpose. Or if you're talking about the film that you have previously said changed your life because the relationship between Holmes and Watson is treated so beautifully, that Holmes is in love with Watson but it's so desperately unspoken, and say this.
You know, you can over-examine these things, which is, of course, why we're here. But that's part of the joy of it, especially if you know a film very well. You can find a fellow enthusiast, and when you meet someone who knows the film you love like that, it's wonderful to examine that. There are certain bits. There's a bit in the Diogenes Club where. With cigar ash, and I've read a whole thing about how this sort of represents the fag end of empire and the fag end of Victoriana, and the whole thing is about everything crumbling around Sherlock Holmes, which is a version, or I don't know, it's a funny joke probably. I think that's probably what it is. But it's definitely got its heart is melancholy, and I think that's what Wilder did best, and it's certainly always the thing that I respond most to in anything is a sort of bittersweet quality. The parody is so sublime, but at its heart, it's deeply touching. And suddenly, all of that flies out the window when you're writing your version of Sherlock Holmes? That doesn't quite add up. Also, that bit about it being a funny joke, what about cigar ash is funny? Unless it's in relation to this specific word Mark used that I'm not going to repeat, when we know this is a film Billy Wilder wrote, intending for Holmes to read as a gay man. That would seem to hint that Mark is reading this, at worst, as a gay joke that isn't really a joke. A trick which, as you know, is all over BBC Sherlock. And then there's BBC Dracula, and the way it uses the exact same playbook as Sherlock does. You have your references to sexual preference through drinking, the connection between eating and being intimate, which is obviously turned up to 11 in A Story with a Vampire, where the act of feeding itself is inherently sexual. We have hearts flying out of phones and elephants grazing in the sunlight. The purpose of a mirror is to show us the truth, and someone wants to tell their audience a story that is also a game.
Why are we talking about stories?
Because I want to tell you one. Please. As you can see, there's a game in progress. was.
And then there are the more obvious tells, starting a show bluntly asking whether the titular character was in a queer relationship, and then answering that question using every means short of actual speech. The focus on an unreliable narrator named Johnny, who no one ever calls that.
No one calls me Johnny. No one. No one.
Since when do you call me John?
You'd be surprised.
No, I wouldn't.
Dracula says to me, at worst, that these are all concepts that they enjoy using and playing with, jokes that aren't really jokes, but they plan to leave it all at a subtextual level. But in light of that ending...
The game is over. You lose. You will live forever in shame.
After all this time, did you think I'd let it hurt?
I have my doubts even about that. Sometimes it seems to me that the most logical conclusion to come to is that two writers who are attentive, detail-focused Holmes fans, who appear to have written a carefully crafted story paying homage to that, have, in fact, written a carefully crafted story paying homage to that. The question then becomes how to make sense of Series 4 in light of that. But I guess we should start with a very basic question before we get to that. Why do people still think there's going to be another series of Sherlock to begin with? From the introduction, you know that I worry that for better or worse, more Sherlock is inevitable, because that's just how the industry works. Even if no one involved was particularly interested, someone would eventually want to resurrect the show.
I'm sure you can understand why our beloved parent company, Warner Brothers, has decided to make a sequel to the trilogy.
What?
They informed me they're going to do it with or without us.
And you might argue that the show tanked, so no one is going to give Mark and Steven the green light again, but they already did. To let them make Dracula. If anything, Dracula shows that the BBC or Hartswood or whoever else is just signing off on whatever these writers want to make happen. Good for them. Mark and Steven have also said pretty consistently that they would like to make more. It's just a matter of finding it difficult to line up Benedict and Martin's timetables.
People ask this question all the time, but it is genuinely terribly difficult to try and get Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman and everybody else back together. Planning this series took a Herculean effort, really.
Yes.
So who knows? There's a huge amount of willingness to do it, and everybody would like to.
No, we'd love to. I just don't know when. It's difficult to get people together. I think there's definitely a will to do it at some stage, but we don't know yet. And obviously Dracula's going to take up our time for quite a while.
It's down to Benedict and Martin. We would do it. I'd do it. Mark would do it. Sue would do it. We might be too sad to get through it, and we'd need our leading men.
Stephen and Sue and I would very much like to do some more, but you may have noticed the cast are very busy. So that's where we are at the moment, really. You know, I mean, but who could say?
So I don't think believing that more of BBC Sherlock will come out at some point is that unreasonable. However, there is a rather large gap between believing that there will be a 5th series of Sherlock and believing that a 5th series will be good. So why do people hold out hope for that? Well, the thing is, before Series 4 came out, everyone sort of took for granted that there was going to be a Series 5 that would round out the show after the big reveal. The reason why is a detail that has been a thorn in my brain for the last 5 years. Before Series 4, Stephen told the story more than once of a rainy day during the filming of His Last Vow, where he and Mark began chatting about the future of the series. Rather excitingly, Mark and I, for no particular reason, just got out of the rain and sat at the top of the Sherlock production bus. Whereas the actors get these marvelous caravans, we go and sit at the top of a double-decker bus that becomes our office. And we sat with all the accountants and we just started talking about what we could do in the future. And we plotted out the whole of Series 4 and 5 in just one day.
Yeah. No, there's been, and it was discussed ages ago. Yeah. And Andrew knew about it,
and we've genuinely been plotting out what we're doing next for quite a while now. So it's all considered.
The Moriarty plan is known by a few others, but a lot else of the next 2 series that we spontaneously came up with
knows about that.
is just me and Mark.
Interesting.
We had on that occasion where we were just sheltering from the rain. Really, it wasn't a scheduled meeting. We were just getting out because it was really whacking down. And we just started idly chatting. We came up with a whole set of things that I think are really, really exciting.
But then Series 4 rolls around, and the story abruptly changes. Suddenly, that discussion was entirely focused on Eurus Holmes, and not a word of Series 5 is mentioned in relation to that day ever again.
When we were shooting His Last Vow, and it was bucketing, it was really bad, so we went and sheltered upstairs with the accountants on the production bus. And we just started talking about the story of the sibling. And then when we were working on His Last Vow, we went had an accidental chat just in the accountant's office, which is the top layer of a double-decker bus, because it is. And we staying out the rain, we just came up with this. The whole story from The Abominable Bride right the way through to the end of this is what we talked about that day.
If you had a 5th series planned, it seems like you'd want to mention that to keep people interested. If you're thinking maybe they dropped the idea because of the fan response to Series 4, 2 of those examples were from the DVD extras and from the advanced BFI screening of The Final Problem, both before the backlash. In fact, in the lead up to Series 4, they began subtly planting the idea that it might actually be the end.
This may be the final problem, but if it is, all we can say is a huge thank you to the incredible team who've made Sherlock what it is today.
Rather than leaving episode 3 on a cliffhanger as we usually do, we sort of leave it in a perfect place where, if that's it, it's a great place to be.
Of course, as I've already mentioned, they do also state that they're open to making more, just that they have nothing planned.
We have an idea for season 5 on a post-it note. That's as far as we've got. Unless I'm lying.
When again...
And we plotted out the whole of Series 4 and 5 in just one day.
And also...
How will fans feel after watching Series 4? Desperate for Series 5.
That's a little weird, Stephen. These writers contradicting themselves is, of course, nothing new. It's their favorite pastime.
Interesting though, isn't it? Because we both now have a reputation, which is not really true, about how we are enjoying doing this. The truth is, it's the only way to keep a secret, is to make everybody distrust everything.
In light of Series 4, people view Mark and Stephen's lies and interviews a bit differently. It's not just out of necessity. This contradiction, and all of the others, are part of the bit. The game extends outside of the text. This is all part of the point they're trying to make.
Doyle did declare, repeatedly, that he had killed off Holmes definitively, and there was no chance of bringing him back. I don't believe a word he says, because he kills him off stage. He doesn't have Holmes dying in Watson's arms, as he surely must. He doesn't do any of that. And everyone takes him at face value on this, despite the fact that he is a professional liar, or, as we know them, writers.
My good friend Mo explains it like this. An artist paints a red painting. He stands next to it where it hangs in the gallery, and when you compliment him on his lovely red painting, he furrows his eyebrows in confusion and tells you that it's blue. The painting is clearly red and you laugh, but he gets angry and insists that it's a blue painting. You and the artist begin arguing, and eventually you throw your hands in the air. That is clearly a red painting. You must be lying. The artist then proceeds to eat the painting and says, a bit smugly, that the painting was blue and tasted delicious. Suddenly you realize that the art wasn't just the painting. This was a performance. The presence of the contrarian artist is itself part of the art. My way back into analyzing Sherlock was Dracula. So I'm going to demonstrate what Mark and Stephen might have done with Series 4 using one of my favorite bits on Dracula, Dracula and Agatha's symbolic chess game. When the game begins, Agatha voluntarily picks the losing side, confident that she can turn things around.
A knight is menacing a queen.
Mm-hmm. Who's knight, who's queen?
Who's black, who's white?
You choose. Oh, the losing side.
We shall see.
And against the odds, she begins to win the game.
I thought it was clever.
You'll have to be cleverer than that. You see, not the losing side.
Which, if you're reading Dracula as a metaphor for Mark and Stephen and their audience, would mirror where we all were when The Abominable Bride came out.
We don't defeat them. We most certainly lose to them, because they are right and we are wrong.
Mycroft was right. This is a war we must lose.
But suddenly, things go wrong.
When did I lose so many pieces? I was winning.
No. You've been losing from the start.
Which is very reminiscent of how it felt to watch The Final Problem when it first aired. We knew we were winning. How did we lose? Agatha in this scene is still focused on trying to win, but Dracula wants to direct her attention elsewhere.
Forget about the chess and concentrate on the game. Who's in cabin number 9?
Dracula has been toying with her this entire time. She wasn't only hearing the story of a ship making its way to England, she was trapped in it too.
One does not hurry such a vintage. I've been making you last.
It's me. I'm in cabin number 9.
So in this scenario, like Agatha, we thought we were watching a story, we were in the story, which I have some thoughts about, and I'm going to come back to them, but I want to focus for now on why they would have set it up this way. What does writing Series 4 the way they did, making it transgressive and contradictory on purpose, then setting it up as their definition of insane wish fulfillment and everything they wanted to do with this story before vanishing into the mist, accomplish thematically? Enter Amy Gart-Gatiss and her meta, BBC Sherlock, a drama in 5 acts. Amy very kindly gave me permission to summarize the essay in this video, and if anything I say here interests you, I would encourage you to check out this meta along with her other work, using the links provided in the description. A Drama in 5 Acts is a follow-up to Amy's 2-part Poetry or Truth series, which focus on the theater of the absurd, or a story that deliberately breaks down the conventional barriers between story and audience to elicit a different type of response from that audience. I highly recommend reading those as well. They provide a lot of context that you can use to understand Series 4, but here I'm going to be focusing solely on the bit about 5-act structure. Like I alluded to before, 5-act structure was a topic of conversation before Series 4 came out, because people took a 5th series for granted at the time. You might remember that I brought it up in the worst episode of TJLC Explained, episode 48. My thinking at the time was that Sherlock was following the structure of a Shakespearean comedy. Something like, I don't know, The Merchant of Venice, where the big climactic moment where the antagonist tries to cut out the heart of one of the heroes occurs at the end of Act 4, leaving Act 5 room to focus on the romantic relationships and resolving the remaining loose ends. Hypothetically speaking. But like so much of that video, I was operating under some inaccurate assumptions at the time. And that's the point here. You're not about to see some horrible, traumatizing thing. Honestly, that is hilarious. Textbook dramatic irony. I wish it was on purpose. Amy's work was the first to really dive deep into 5-act structure and how it might actually be at play on BBC Sherlock. She examined Sherlock through the lens of Into the Woods by John Yorke. It's not a random choice. Stephen's show Jekyll was commissioned by Yorke. Yorke was still in a position of influence at the BBC around the time Mark and Stephen were setting out to begin working on Sherlock, and most notably, the infamous switch that occurred between the filming of the unaired pilot and A Study in Pink from 6 60-minute episodes to 3 90-minute episodes perfectly sets up the show to slot into Yorke's model of 5-act structure. Yorke's central idea in Into the Woods is that storytelling is ultimately a form of argument. And as someone who writes nothing but stories that are arguments and arguments that are stories, I think he's onto something. He sets out a specific method through which this can be achieved by the writer, consciously or unconsciously. The progression of thesis, or starting idea, to antithesis, or opposing idea, and then landing on the synthesis, combining both thesis and antithesis to arrive at the final conclusion. Let's go back to Dracula as an example. Agatha begins with a thesis for why Dracula cannot bear the sight of the cross. It's because he can't stand the virtue it represents. She is wrong.
That is why you can't bear the sight of this. It is goodness incarnate.
For a moment there, I thought you were clever. No, that's not why I fear the cross.
In the following episode, Dracula provides his own explanation, the antithesis, that so much evil has been done in the name of the cross that it has become a symbol for terror and fear, which he has absorbed from the blood of those he preys upon. This, too, is wrong.
It's not a symbol of virtue and kindness. It's a mark of horror and oppression.
No, I mean, that's all very nice and logical, but that's not the reason.
The real answer lies somewhere in the middle. What Dracula fears is what the cross reveals about himself. Instead of laying down his life for others, he prolongs his own at their expense.
Now we know why this works. Because it speaks of the courage you long to possess. The courage it takes to die. I call you ashamed
He's not afraid of goodness. He is not dismissive of evil. He longs to be good. He is ashamed of his own evil. And this reveal would not be as impactful as it is without having presented both the thesis and the antithesis before arriving at this synthesis. You might be pointing out that this is an example of 3-act structure rather than 5. And you would be correct. Part of what York adds to the discussion of structure is layering a 3-act structure within a 5-act structure, so that each act has its own thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Sound familiar? Let's take a look at some of the parting ideas of each episode of Sherlock. Series 1, Episode 1. John Watson could be the making of Sherlock Holmes.
Interesting, that soldier fellow. He could be the making of my brother. Or make him worse than ever.
Episode 2. No, he can't. John is going to leave Sherlock to be with a romantic interest.
Don't worry. Next date won't be like this.
Episode 3. John values Sherlock above his own life. Is that because he has a romantic interest in him?
You've rather shown your hand there, Dr. Watson.
I'm glad no one saw that. You ripping my clothes off in a darkened swimming pool, people might talk.
Series 2, Episode 1. Sherlock saved the woman. Maybe that's because he loved her.
He doesn't feel things that way.
My brother has the brain of a scientist or a philosopher, yet he elects to be a detective. What might we deduce about his heart?
The woman.
Episode 2. Sherlock is a sociopath incapable of love.
You locked me in that bloody lab.
I had to. It was an experiment.
An experiment? I was terrified, Sherlock. I was scared to death.
Episode 3. Sherlock just sacrificed everything to keep John safe. Could it be because he loves him?
One more miracle, Sherlock, for me. Don't be dead.
Series 3, Episode 1. Something is being left unsaid between Sherlock and John, but maybe they can continue their adventures anyway.
I asked you to stop being dead.
I heard you.
Anyway,
Time to go and be Sherlock Holmes.
Episode 2. No, they can't. It's too late. But it looks like the something being left unsaid is romantic in nature.
Baker Street, behind closed curtains. Mrs. Hudson came in one time. Don't know how those rumours started.
Episode 3. Definitely romantic. Not confessing did nearly ruin things, but they have another chance.
John, there's something I should say. I've meant to say always and I never have. Since it's unlikely we'll ever meet again, I might as well say it now.
Miss me?
Series 4, Episode 1. Sherlock Holmes is a story that has always ended the same way. This is a story about trying to avoid that fate.
Death waits for us all in Samara. But can Samara be avoided?
Episode 2. No, it's not. It's a story about a secret evil sister.
Didn't it ever occur to you, not even once, that Sherlock's secret brother might just be Sherlock's secret sister?
Episode 3. The story did explore who Sherlock and John are, but who they really are doesn't matter. It's all about the legend, the same as it always has been.
Will you listen to me? Who you really are, it doesn't matter. It's all about the legend, the stories, the adventures.
The don't you wish you could escape this fate is strongly implied. Those are just a few examples. Each episode has a couple different parting ideas you could draw from it, but these examples kind of clearly demonstrate the central arguments at work on the show, our 3 questions that are 1 question. By the way, do you remember that quote where Stephen made it sound like he's read and cried over John Locke fanfiction? What was his only complaint about it again?
There's been some eye-watering stuff of Benedict and Martin together. A load of it has been superb. There's a tendency to disparage it. I don't agree. Even the slash fiction, that's a great way to learn to work. No one really does 3-act structure.
I think that's unfair. Some of us are writing fics with 3-act structure, Stephen. Jokes aside, the ideas most relevant to this discussion are the placement of the major thesis and antithesis of the overarching story. The thesis, or what York also calls the inciting incident, comes from Act 1. Amy identifies the end of A Study in Pink, and I'm going to weave in the end of The Great Game as well. Combining the two, we get the thesis that this Holmes adaptation is going to reveal something about John and Sherlock's relationship.
Either way, we better upgrade their surveillance status. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson.
That Sherlock and John take priority in one another's hearts, which seems to suggest something about the nature of that relationship.
What would you like me to make him say next?
You've rather shown your hand there, Dr. Watson.
And that our ultimate conflict is an allegorical one. The heroes will be facing off against Moriarty, just as the show exists to correct the Holmes fans and storytellers getting it wrong.
You can't be allowed to continue. You just can't.
This comes from a place of us being fans. This wasn't a case of, let's grab that off the shelf and update it. It was, we love this, we think everybody's been getting it wrong, and we think we can get it right. Unless you think you're correcting everyone else, you shouldn't be doing something. You should be saying, now this is the way it should be done.
So in a way, we're very much addressing an audience who don't love Sherlock Holmes the way we do, and we're trying to persuade them to do that.
Another feature of interest on York's model of story structure is the midpoint, where you will often get a glimpse of the truth at the heart of the story. The midpoint of Sherlock, the scene in The Sign of Three that I highlighted for answering all of our thematic questions. The scene where we learn that Sherlock isn't particularly focused on cases. To him, there is only one feature of interest: the man who is just as vital to this story as he is, the man he loves and who loves him in return. John Watson.
There are mysteries worth solving and stories worth telling. The best and bravest man I know, and on top of that, he actually knows how to do stuff.
That scene also involves someone being stabbed, and the crucial action is saving their life, preventing their murder, just in case anyone was curious. And for reference, the midpoint of Dracula was this scene.
I thought it was clever.
Ah, you'll have to be cleverer than that. Ha! The boat was a dress rehearsal for life in England. You see? Not the losing side.
Which is fitting. The ultimate antithesis, according to York, comes at the end of Act 4, the worst point, where everything you do not want to happen happens. And so if your thesis is that your show is a slowly unfolding love story between Holmes and Watson, and that the central conflict of the story is an allegory for getting that story told, your antithesis can only be one thing. No, it's not. It never was. There is no overarching plan. This show has only ever been about silly hijinks, and about the stories, the adventures, the legend. As Amy puts it, it's not a show about a detective, it's just another detective show.
This kind of is the story that ends the process of them kind of living up to the legend. Sherlock Holmes figures out that's who he is. He's just going to be that now.
It's like a new beginning for them, you know. They're going to be back on adventures solving crimes as friends, which is, you know, a lovely thing.
This, then, would be the reason that Series 4 is like that. Mark and Stephen couldn't make this particular point and just have the characters stuck in their lowest moment, because their theme, the central question I've been harping about for hours now, is about the nature of the story itself. What were the Holmes stories truly about? To truly present the antithesis for that theme, you have to answer that question in the worst possible way. This show, and by extension the Holmes stories, weren't about anything other than the legend of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. The true story, if there were such a thing, will never be told. The antithesis is introduced with the goal of eventually arriving at the final synthesis. This story is a romance. It always was, and always should have been. You don't enjoy the Holmes stories if they aren't about John and Sherlock's relationship. We've proven that. You want the true story. That's what everyone has been getting wrong. Telling the left story is how you finally get it right. I already told Amy this personally, so I don't feel weird saying it here. I found this meta much more convincing than I expected to. It sold me on the idea of Series 4 being a thematic necessity more than I thought was possible considering how badly I took it. I think she's onto something. But I have some thoughts. Not about Amy's work, which is lovely, but the underlying plan we would be dealing with in this scenario. And so I will have to ask the patience of my TJLC homies in the audience once again, because it is time for the complaint section of the video. For the rest of you who I have been bringing along, perhaps kicking and screaming, I hope that this section gets at some of what you might be thinking right now. I'm going to start with a couple of complaints that I personally don't have, but that I think will be most pertinent for a lot of you. First, Let's talk logistics. Am I seriously saying that they wrote Series 4 knowing that it went against the point of the show and that it was intentionally off-putting? What are the odds of that? With these guys? High. One of the central tenets of this retrospective is that these guys just tell the story that they want to tell regardless of the consequences. That's true as an argument against them purposefully baiting their audience, and it's true here. They admitted to making the final problem transgressive on purpose.
And above all, you know those complaints about it being a bit too James Bondy and action-y? Not till tonight.
The word was, we kept saying transgressive. Everything should be like we're breaking rules.
From the beginning, Steve and I conceived this script as being full of transgressions.
They have repeatedly and consistently said that they never expected this show to be a success, that it completely surprised them.
If it is, all we can say is a huge thank you to the incredible team who've made Sherlock what it is today. And as Piers says, an absolute phenomenon which has taken us all by surprise. It's been an amazing roller coaster, but nothing like the Pepsi Max you were about to go on.
We thought it would be like an audience of 4 million and an obscure audience from a Polish, obscure award from a Polish festival or something like that. We thought it'd be that level. We didn't. And it happened so completely suddenly. We've barely finished the show, and it's this enormous hit, and there seemed to be no intervening moment of escalation. It just happened.
We actually went, the sort of sense of ownership, 50 years of Doctor Who, we actually had after 90 minutes. It just went right.
And again, they insist that they do not let fan response sway them from what they want to do.
But in the same sort of way, I think you can't make it for anyone other than yourself. You can't, just because people get cross with the notion that Sherlock might fall in a species of love doesn't mean you can't do it.
One, I think we have to be pure and write the show kind of for ourselves, which is really what we do.
It's, as Steve says, we've got to be, we're doing it for ourselves always. You can't let that into your head, because it'll start to, it starts to actually change the course of what you're trying to do, and we're really just still making it for ourselves.
Now, it's not just Mark and Steven's call here, but this is where another justified complaint frequently made against Sherlock is actually a point in favor of the argument: the nepotism. Would a producer really agree to let them take this kind of risk with a show that had become an international phenomenon? Well, it helps when the producers are your wife and your mother-in-law. It might partially explain why Steven was rhapsodizing about how critical Sue is to the show at the screening for the final problem.
If we never come back, and we never do another panel about Sherlock, which seems improbable, there is one thing I would like to say, and that is, and it's not said enough, and it sort of goes by unnoticed, is the boss of Sherlock, the number one person on Sherlock, sitting in front of you right now, isn't me or Mark, isn't anybody else. It's the person to whom I married. It's Sue. She's the person who made us write it in the first place. It has been her project from the very beginning. She manages the estate of Sherlock every single day. She's the general. She's the chief executive officer. She is the absolute ultimate boss of this show, and has not been said often enough.
And I reiterate, these same producers gave Mark and Steven literal millions of pounds to make BBC Dracula.
I don't know about you girls, but I do love a bit of fur. Suffer on to me.
Come, boy. Suckle.
So beautiful.
Count Dracula has rights.
Did you think I'd let it hurt?
Someone is just handing these guys blank checks, and I really cannot wait for that hypothetical adaptation of BBC Dorian. Point 2. The hiatus. It has been so long since Series 4. So they just dropped that bomb on the show and walked away for literal years? Yeah, that's part of the point. What was that finale called again? The Final Problem, right? If you wanted to kill off Sherlock before a lengthier than usual hiatus, is there a better time to do it?
It might be the end of an era. It feels like the end of an era, to be honest. It goes to a place where it will be pretty hard to follow on immediately. We never say never on the show. I'd love to revisit it. I'd love to keep revisiting it. I stand by that. But in the immediate future, we all have things we want to crack on with, and we've made something very complete as it is. So I think we'll just wait and see. So he knew perfectly well that he was leaving the door open to Sherlock Holmes' return, but he wanted to do other things for a while.
And worse yet is the way that the actual adaptation of the original story titled The Final Problem, The Reichenbach Fall, appears to foreshadow what they were going to do later, which would mean this has been in the works for quite a while.
Yeah. No, there's been, and it was discussed ages ago. Yeah. And Andrew knew about it,
and we've genuinely been plotting out what we're doing next for quite a while now. So it's all considered.
I think a large part of the reason for the lengthy hiatus is necessity. When everyone involved talks about how hard it is to schedule this show, I believe them. Martin and Benedict are still fairly busy these days. They might have known going into Series 4 that it would be a while before they could follow it up, and so they used it to their advantage, making it part of the meta-commentary, recreating the great hiatus before they resurrect the show in a blaze of glory. That does lead me to my first complaint. If that's what they intend to do, if this is all a very elaborate form of commentary on the home stories, I don't think they have gone about making that argument particularly well. Like, okay, let's say this reading is correct. You guys think people don't give Doyle the credit he's due, that underneath all the mistakes there lurks a deliberate and careful writer who didn't do anything by accident. Or at the very least, you read the stories as if that's true, and you're trying to fill his shoes to help people read the stories the same way you do. Maybe there's even a bit of commentary about how people willfully overlook the queer elements in the stories, how they'll accept a lie that's preferable to the truth. I think the vehemence with which you have denied the idea is maybe overselling that particular point, but leaving that aside, I can see how you've written in service of those goals. It is all over your story. However, because these are subtextual threads, to the vast majority of people, all you're doing is making yourselves look bad. And maybe you don't care about that. I suspect that you don't, but in doing things this way, you have hindered your ability to convince your audience on the true nature of the home stories. Think about it from the standpoint of someone who knows very little about Sherlock. You have 2 good series, one slightly less good one, a nonsensical Christmas special, and a 4th series that is an absolute train wreck. Then 6, 7, 8 years later, the show comes back and makes Sherlock and John gay? That's not going to read as a thematic point. Your average viewer is going to think the writers caved to fan pressure to save their show. That's going to weaken the impact that this story could have had. It seems to me that they prioritize making a clever point over making an effective one. You can follow perfect 5-act structure all day long, and it seems like they are. But if you scare off everyone but a couple hundred people in the process of making your point, perhaps you have not done a great job constructing your argument. Now again, I'm pretty sure that they don't care about the vast majority of their audience not getting their point. They prioritize telling the story they want to tell above all else. But there's a difference between not writing to pander to an audience and writing in a way that actively alienates everyone who wants to care about your story, even the vast majority of those who are invested in your core message, and were carefully analyzing the ways you are delivering it. When I said in the first video that I have philosophical differences with Mark and Stephen, this is a big part of what I meant. Broadly speaking, I don't really blame them for what happened, even in this scenario. But I do think they could have avoided it if they had gone about things differently. There's a sentiment that I have seen among some current TJLC members that anyone who couldn't handle Series 4 just needs to get over it. That this is how the show always was. And in some ways, they're right. Looking back on it, Series 4 was actually fairly well foreshadowed throughout. That's going to be the last section of this video. But in others, no, I don't think anyone needs to get over this. Deciding that if the writers want to push their audience this far to make a point, you don't want to be a part of that audience, is a perfectly valid and reasonable conclusion to come to. In fact, I think it's also perfectly understandable that former TJLCers look at even obvious elements of the queer love story and just ask in frustration, why did this happen? Why is this here? Instead of taking the next logical step and returning to the conclusion that it was on purpose. Because it's not a small step. Deciding to re-engage with this after being heartbroken over it feels like voluntarily agreeing to step out of a plane mid-flight with Mark and Stephen holding the button that will activate your parachute. And that seems like a terrifying risk. There is very little reason to trust that the writers will make sure you land safely. They've already let you crash once. Even if they do hit the button, there are even more reasons to worry that this story isn't going to be able to end in a way that is satisfying after all this. That after all the effort of psyching yourself up to make a leap of faith, the terror of the plunge, you'll still land somewhere you don't want to be. From the outside, there are so many obvious risks, and so little perceivable reward. I'm personally glad that I pushed through that fear, because it's not actually that high stakes if you're doing it right. Less like skydiving, more like letting yourself fall backwards onto your bed. For me, that was the final catharsis to be found. Taking something that seemed so potentially devastating and completely defanging it. Being able to look at the possibility that once terrified me and say, yeah, it might not be that clever. There might be nothing to see through. I'm willing to find a better story in it all the same. But it was a lot of work to arrive here, and I completely understand why most don't. I suspect the root of the problem here is that their antithesis, this was never that clever, who these characters are, who you really are, doesn't matter, and the true story will never be told, is a bit too visceral of a worst point to intentionally play with. And I don't think it's entirely on them to know the extent to which this was going to hurt people. But based on some of the subtext, I also suspect that they did to an extent see a fallout coming. That they have known all along, but especially for this series, that this plan was maybe not going to go over well.
I thought this was some kind of... What? Trick.
It's not a trick, it's a plan.
What plan?
I'm not telling you.
Why not?
Because you won't like it.
But they did it anyway. And that's where I disagree with their methods. In my opinion, the focus of every good storyteller should be their audience. Maybe not everyone who will come across their work, but the people they hope to reach, the people they're telling the story for. And you should treat those people with care. But here's the rub. I also suspect that I'm not alone in thinking that. If we're operating under the assumption that TJLC is the right way to understand these writers, then based on the subtext at the core of Dracula, it would appear that Mark and Stephen look back at what they've done in their single-minded pursuit of their art, their legend, in the name of playing by the rules of their game, and have some regrets.
Go ahead. I win. The last thing your eyes will ever see is the contempt in mine.
I call you ashamed. Count Dracula is ashamed.
The game is over. You lose. You will live forever in shame.
That they do, now at least, take that responsibility towards their audience seriously.
It's a commitment. It's a contract between an author and a reader, and I have to be engaged at once.
After all this time, did you think I'd let it hurt?
And the reason I'm inclined to believe them is that the way Dracula is written demonstrates that they have, at least partially, learned a lesson. The show is dark on the surface, but if you're reading the subtext, it's as bright as the sun. Yes, their story is still a game, because they can't quite seem to give that up. But it's one with easy and consistent rules that they gently and clearly invite the audience to play. In fact, at times, it seems like the writers are practically begging their intended audience to pick up the invitation and understand them.
Blood is everything you need to know. If you understand how to read it, have you worked out how yet? If you ever hope to match me, you'll have to.
That's still a big ask on their part. Trust, once lost, cannot easily be restored and all. But if you agree to play along, the subtext in Dracula has everything I personally wanted to hear from them. In it, they seem to say, what you saw was really there, we are ashamed of what our work has done, and we will try to make it right. That doesn't change what happened. That they had the opportunity to tell this story differently, and they didn't. Maybe they thought that this was the only way to fully make their point. And maybe they were even partially correct. But at the end of the day, if this is a game, it's been a cruel one, and one that has damaged the reputation of the show and its writers, maybe forever. That might be part of why they think they'll live forever in shame. BBC Sherlock being the first, or one of the first Holmes adaptations, to portray an explicitly romantic relationship between Holmes and Watson would still have an impact, probably a significant one, but I don't think it will be the same after this. And I think it's understandable to grieve the future that never was. Whether you forgive the writers is up to you. I would encourage you to try. Less for the sake of getting back into this. I still don't want to convince you of that, but for your own. Bitterness isn't just a paralytic, it's a poison, and my veins feel lighter in its absence. I want the same for you. That doesn't mean you have to dedicate a lot of time to this or like what they've done. I only put in all this work initially because I felt an obligation to you all, and I still don't particularly love what they've done. My opinion on Series 4, even when I'm reading TJLC into it?
Not the way I'd have done it.
Oh, really?
No, I'm not saying it's not clever, but...
What?
Bit... disappointed.
I'm not here to exhaustively argue that point either. I already did when I wrote From a Drop of Water. That's how I would have done it. I can move past it because I don't need this show to be everything I wanted anymore. It is what it is, and what it is still might be a better story than I thought it was. There are some interesting things potentially happening here, and I've found a way to leave aside what I wanted this story to be and enjoy engaging with what we got. So, let's talk about Series 4.
That's not what happened at all.
It is now.
Does that come out? Oh, they never come out when I take them.
I'm afraid that some of the memories you've had up to this point might also be corrupted.
So this is the story that you're going to publish. The big conclusion of it all. Moriarty's an actor?
Surprise. You didn't think I'd just disappear, did you?
As you'll remember from our Bop Fest in Part 5, Series 4 of BBC Sherlock is weird and nonsensical. Glowing skulls that definitely aren't glowing, just like that one. Characters acting not a bit like themselves, the show going out of its way to break its own rules, and taking plot threads that had previously been presented as jokes and playing them dead straight. If you're paying attention to the subtext, part of what that subtext is telling you is that what you're seeing can't actually be happening, which is a little disconcerting to pick up on when the people involved with making the show are insisting that you ruined their show by expecting the subtext to pay off. No wonder almost everyone left. But if we're working under the assumption that was all part of the game, the literary criticism by means of satire, if we're going to examine Series 4, we should start with making sense of the nonsense. I'll first remind you that we have two examples of these writers similarly playing with the diegesis to hint that what is happening isn't real. The Abominable Bride, where characters throw out anachronisms, things keep breaking down, and the transitions are dreamlike because the entire thing is a dream, and Blood Vessel, which begins with a scene of Dracula and Agatha laughing together, talking about stories and games, when the last episode ended with Dracula killing Johnny Harker in front of her and terrorizing her and Mina Murray. That was the point. It wasn't real. Agatha was trapped. Of course, there's a difference between doing that sort of thing for the majority of an episode before revealing the deception, and doing it for a whole series that you've sold as everything you wanted to do, and then vanishing into the mist for several years. The latter has a high probability of not going over well. Not that it's impossible to pull off, but you would have stacked the odds against yourself. But let's look at how they might try to stick the landing. There are two broad categories for meta on Series 4. The two ways fans explain what is really happening under the surface. EMP and blog theory. Let's start with EMP because it's been around longer. EMP, or Extended Mind Palace, is the idea that after a certain point, everything that happens on BBC Sherlock is happening in Sherlock's Mind Palace, hence the whole thing being Extended Mind Palace. There are two scenes most frequently placed as the starting point for EMP. When Sherlock gets on the plane at the end of his last vow, and the most popular, when Mary shoots Sherlock. There are a few outliers, people saying that Sherlock falls into a coma when he jumps off St. Bart's, or that the entire show is Sherlock dreaming, but the two options in his last vow are the most common. There are little oddities, things like this plant moving as Sherlock falls backwards, or Mycroft's tie changing between the end of his last vow and the real scenes in The Abominable Bride, that are most commonly pointed to as evidence. Miranda, BBC Sherlock, wrote an excellent meta on EMP theory applied to the Six Thatchers, using the plane in The Abominable Bride as the starting point. There's a link to that down below. I do recommend giving it a read, even if you don't think you like EMP. It makes a great case for the reading. Overall, I think this theory is clever and detail-oriented, but my reservation with the EMP reading has always been that revealing the entire show, or vast portions of it, are all a dream would be pretty unsatisfying from an audience standpoint, and more importantly in my mind, this reveal wouldn't really tie into the themes of the show. Sherlock dreaming the events that occur on the show says nothing about how these writers view the home stories, except there's a way it might. There is a version of Extended Mind Palace that has my full and entire support. The one presented in the end of The Abominable Bride, that the entire show is the original Holmes' dream of the future. That has major thematic resonance, and if the show ended with that reveal, I would be perfectly happy with that, as you may already know. But that's not usually what people mean when they talk about EMP. Now, that doesn't mean EMP is wrong. I have learned that just because I wouldn't like something, that doesn't mean it's not what the writers are doing. Clearly. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking about this version of Series 4 at all. Again, leaving aside my concerns for how the reveal might play out, I do think this is a clever theory and is a valid way to try to make sense of the show. But those are the reasons why I'm still hesitant to use this approach. On some level, I still want it to be a better story than this. Again, according to my tastes. In block theory, the events of Series 4 are a distorted version of real events as presented to us through the highly unreliable account of John Watson. The fact that John's blog in the real world stopped updating for Series 4 was a clue that the show itself is now John's blog. The same goes for the fact that the title of the first episode, The Six Thatchers, is recycled from John's blog and no one is addressing it, because he's using that old story as a way to explore more recent events. This also explains the scenes where it feels like John is being written out of the narrative.
The main feature of interest in the field of criminal investigation is not the sensational aspects of the crime itself, but rather the iron chain of reasoning. That's the only truly remarkable aspect of the entire affair. But in all of this, there is only one element which can be said to be truly remarkable. There was one feature, and only one feature, of interest in the whole of this baffling case, and quite frankly, it was the usual. John Watson.
Because John is literally writing himself out. There were some promotional materials for Series 4 that talked about John's alibi, but on the surface, there's nothing John would need an alibi for. But if you look for the mirrors, you'll see that John has done a few things he'd want to hide. Now, again, when I first started exploring this theory, I also found this more than a little irritating. Why give us John's version of events instead of just showing us what's happening like the rest of the show? I found it frustrating to have to wade through all these mistakes and contradictions and moments that can't have happened just to try to get a glimpse of the underlying truth. But then I realized as I was having that internal dialogue a few months back that there is one story that I do read that way, that I enjoy reading that way, where I think the narrator is constantly lying to his audience and changing events to cover up the truth. A story I read trying to glimpse the truth that's being buried underneath all the contradictions and apparent mistakes. The home stories, as presented by the highly unreliable John Watson. And that gives this reading an edge in my mind, because that has pretty clear thematic implications for how Mark and Stephen view the Holmes canon. And this is an idea that they've already introduced on the show.
That is the version of you that I present to the public. The brain without a heart. The calculating machine. I write all of that, Holmes, and the readers lap it up, but I do not believe it.
My other reason for leaning towards block theory is that most of the mirror characters hint at things that seem more like preoccupations John would have than Sherlock. We know what Sherlock's head looks like, the things he hopes for and is afraid of, and it didn't look like this. But if you had a good handle on John's character before Series 4, yeah, he's missing on the surface, but everything that happens has his particular brand of damage all over it. This would explain the characterizations for both John and Sherlock in this series. Sherlock is more or less himself. The only changes are that he doesn't seem to value John's contributions to cases, except when he does, and that he's even more impossibly brilliant, seeing through everyone around him, and especially John, weeks in advance. That's how John sees Sherlock. Sherlock's thematic question, who he really is, remains intact throughout Series 4 because that's the question that drives John as a character. And generally, John knows who Sherlock is. He's just missing the most important bit of information, that being who Sherlock is in love with, the person with whom he could find true fulfillment. John, meanwhile, is a 5'6" ball of self-esteem issues, full of guilt and shame and self-doubt and self-loathing, before we even get to some of the actions exacerbating those feelings in Series 4. Those elements of his character played a big role in the way I wrote him in Phaedo. Here, John writes himself like a useless, unfaithful, violent monster because that's who he's afraid he is. And again, he doesn't realize how important he is to Sherlock. Hence, those two thematic questions are given the answers John is most afraid of. John doesn't matter to the story, and he doesn't matter to Sherlock. I'd also argue that Mark and Steven's choice to cast Johnny Harker as an unreliable narrator in Dracula, whose written account was complete garbled nonsense, and Agatha had to listen to his spoken confession in order to get the truth, when, as I've mentioned, in the book, Jonathan Harker's account was perfectly faithful, is potentially another point in favor of this reading. So I'm going to try to make sense of Series 4 using a version of blog theory. If you wanted to interpret Series 4 through an EMP lens, take the mirrors and situations I point out and ask what they reveal about how Sherlock thinks and feels. It's kind of that simple. That's another reason I'm not focusing on it. There's not as much to sink your teeth into, really. Treat Series 4 like it's more tab, done and dusted. But with blog theory, there's an actual true version of events to discover underneath the smoke and mirrors. And while I found that concept frustrating initially, as soon as I made the connection to the game, it became a very compelling puzzle. So here's my attempt to fit those pieces together.
John, what is that?
That is me. Well, it's a me substitute.
This is another instance where I think the experience of writing from a drop of water is working in my favor, because I spent months going over what the show had set up by the end of The Abominable Bride, the questions that had been raised, the potential answers, and how you could fit those elements together from that point. And the time I spent thinking about those plot threads prepped me to instantly recognize them. So the thing is, if Mark and Steven are using subtext, if the whole story is being presented through John, all of the questions we had going into Series 4 are answered, just not on the surface. The information is given to you out of order and through a series of mirror characters. But as we all know,
mirrors can give us space to imagine, or worse, show us the truth.
Yeah, that's about where John's head is at here. So the way I'm reading it, the Six Thatchers, the Lying Detective, and the Final Problem each provide a different perspective on the same set of events, with each iteration becoming more and more detached from reality. I kind of like to imagine John is in this frantic writing session and beginning to spiral. Episode 1, he writes while the events are still fresh, so it's overlaid with flashbacks to the main event. Episode 2, he's beginning to get more emotional, the characters representing himself get more demented. And then Episode 3, it's like late at night and there's a horror movie playing in the background, and John is just in full anxiety mode, writing out all of his worst fears. From what I can suss out, I think this differs slightly from the main take on blog theory, which is that Thatchers and Lying Detective are told from John's point of view, but then the Final Problem is either a dream John is having, possibly while he's bleeding out, or is just genuinely not happening at all, even in a dream. That discrepancy doesn't quite sit right with me, and I'd rather keep it consistent just for my own sake. And I think reading it this way does also make sense, and would provide an easier launching off point for a potential Series 5. The fact that the events really happening are all jumbled together is another callback to the game, a lot of which consists of trying to make the timeline of events in the Holmes canon make sense. That definitely seems to be at play here. So in my read, the events John is writing about take place between the time Sherlock and John leave the tarmac and when John and Sherlock return to Baker Street after something happens at an aquarium.
You can't arrest the jellyfish.
You could try.
We did try.
You might already know where I'm going with that, but I'm waiting to address that until almost the end of this section. I want to set everything else up first. This timeline would mean that everything happens before Mary gives birth.
What's Mary? 59 missed calls. We're in a lot of trouble.
Which, of course, would mean...
Johnny, there is no baby.
That would also explain johnsblog.jpg, where John pretends to type a blog post that mentions both expecting to be a father and complaining about having to change his baby's nappies while Mary is still pregnant in the same scene. The baby is never born. He's making all of it up. It also explains why Rosie really only factors into the plot the one time it serves a narrative function, namely, to make sure that John is just a minute too late arriving at this scene.
Well, we should both stay and wait for her.
I mean, you know that's not going to happen. If there's more to this case, you're the one who needs to see it.
Yeah, okay, you win.
Mary!
John wants it to look like he couldn't possibly have been there, for some reason. This reading also provides an explanation for the plot hole of Sherlock's birthday taking place in The Lying Detective, when it definitely hasn't been a full year since the series started. It's the other possible answer. A version of that scene really did happen 5 days after the tarmac, shortly after Sherlock had overdosed. Sherlock's overdose on the plane is John's inspiration for the drug plotline in The Lying Detective. I'm also going to go out on a limb and say that this reading also means that Eurus is not real either. We'll circle back to the reason why, but I think John is aware that Sherlock and Mycroft have, or my preferred answer, had, another sibling, and is using that character to work through some of his issues. It explains how much weight is placed on the twist that the brother might be a sister, because as Mark and Stephen have said, it isn't that clever, but John might think it is. Not only is he always bringing up secret twins, this particular twist was also the very first thing he saw Sherlock get wrong.
Didn't it ever occur to you, not even once, that Sherlock's secret brother might just be Sherlock's secret sister?
Harry's your sister. Yes, sister. Yeah. Always something.
So that's the basic gist. Everything that actually happens in Series 4 occurs during that initial montage in The Six Thatchers, where it felt like the story was just skipping over and speeding through a lot of crucial information before grinding to a halt. Because it was. The entire series fits in that period of time. The information is being presented out of order and is either being distorted through the use of a mirror character.
That is me. Well, it's a me substitute.
Or is a complete fabrication reflecting on John's fears and insecurities.
Hang on, Mary's better than me.
Well, she's a retired super agent with a terrifying skill set. Of course she's better.
Instead of trying to go through the episodes in order, I'm going to approach this by examining each of the questions that BBC Sherlock had set up by the ending of The Abominable Bride, which were completely ignored or just given the most boring possible explanation on the surface level, but all of which are more or less answered in a satisfactory way by the subtext. So we'll start with a series of questions pertaining to the events at Magnuson's tower in his last vow. When Mary shot Sherlock, did she mean to kill him?
Oh, Sherlock, if you take one more step, I swear I will kill you.
I'm sorry for shooting you that time. I'm really sorry.
We kind of already covered the answer to this in part 4. At the time, I hinted that while the show has been trying to confuse the audience with conflicting information the entire run, the technique present throughout Series 4 really properly began in his last vow. The story jumps all over chronologically in a deliberate attempt to conceal how unbelievable the explanation Sherlock provides really is.
It's structurally allows you to get past the fact that Mary's has shot Sherlock and been revealed to be a villain, and now he's going to be forgiven in a relatively short space of time, and you sort of buy it. Curiously, I think if you did that in a linear way, you think not enough time has passed somehow.
In a first brush through Series 4, it would appear that we're meant to take Sherlock's explanation at face value after all. It was surgery, and Mary is a very nice person. But then we have AJ.
You know, you do, don't you? You know the bitch.
Even in the video where I was making a valiant effort not to analyze anything, I couldn't stop myself from pointing out how obvious a John mirror AJ is. If he is John, AJ's rage towards Mary would seem to indicate that perhaps there's something to still be angry over. The same is true for all the tiny little reminders of villain Mary peppered throughout.
Go to hell, Sherlock. Are you going to tell her about me?
No.
Why not?
Because I can't. You know I can't. She thinks you're dead.
I swear my wife is channeling Satan. Yes.
It's an idea the writers don't want you to forget. They want you to be unsatisfied with the explanation John is giving you through his story. So we have our answer from his last vow. Sherlock arrives, Magnuson asks if she plans to kill both of them, and Mary smiles.
What do you do now? Kill us both?
Mary.
We can see in the background here that Magnuson is reaching for his phone. This is also backed up by the script, and he looks up when Sherlock is shot. It seems likely that he was trying to call emergency services, so he was the one to call the ambulance, not Mary. And he has a motivation to make sure Sherlock is safe. After all, Sherlock is his one and only pressure point for Mycroft. If Sherlock is dead, he kind of loses his only bargaining chip. After Sherlock is shot, we hear the word kill and put down and dying and murder over and over and over.
I swear I will kill you.
You're most certainly going to die. What's going to kill you?
What was directly behind you when you were murdered?
It's the next thing that's going to kill you.
They're putting me down too now.
We're losing you.
Sherlock flatlines on the operating table, and the doctors give up and walk away.
You're gonna love being dead, Sherlock.
For all intents and purposes, Sherlock dies. He only comes back because he's terrified of the danger Mary presents to John.
That wife. You're letting him down, Sherlock. John Watson is definitely in danger.
Mary, instead of explaining herself to Sherlock, goes to his hospital room to threaten him to keep his mouth shut.
Sherlock. You don't tell John. Look at me and tell me you're not going to tell him.
Sherlock imagines her as a mysterious, threatening figure in his mind. He then runs away. Mary is determined to find him before he can talk. Sherlock calls John and has Mary reveal just enough about herself. She would shoot Sherlock again here, if not for the reminder that she would be caught.
How good a shot are you?
How badly do you want to find out?
If I die here, my body will be found in a building with your face projected on the front of it. Even Scotland Yard could get somewhere with that.
She never offers any explanation and looks confused when Sherlock calls her shot surgery, and is baffled that he would help her.
That was surgery. I'll take the case.
What case?
At Baker Street, she lets Sherlock do all the talking. He provides the entire excuse for her, and she only speaks to use Sherlock's words against John.
Why is she like that? Because you chose her.
Because he's right. It's what you like.
Sherlock looks pained watching this happen, and I think the most important thing Sherlock says in this entire conversation is this line.
John, Magnuson is all that matters now. You can trust Mary. She shot you. Mixed messages, I got you.
That final statement literally puts him into cardiac arrest, and we see John glare at Mary over what she's done. So if you're paying attention to the events as they occur, yeah, it seems like Mary shot Sherlock and meant to kill him. She said as much herself. She could have pistol whipped him like she did to Magnuson. She could have shot him in the leg to stop him from following her, but she shot him somewhere she knew at the very least had a high probability of killing him. If she had done what Sherlock said, she herself would have offered it up as a defense to Sherlock or to John, but she doesn't. Instead, she threatens Sherlock multiple times and lets Sherlock provide an excuse for her. This is the same conclusion we came to before. I just thought it would be a good idea to re-establish this process in familiar territory. The way all of this is so clearly hinted at, but then never delivered on, made a lot of us think that the show had been careless for longer than we wanted to believe. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to say that was the wrong conclusion to come to, that all of this was set up for a reason. Mary did mean to kill Sherlock, but they wanted you to have to be paying attention to know that. It's sort of a trial run for what was to come, because that's actually easy mode from here on out. While the answer is being obfuscated, it's still all coming from the characters themselves, rather than being told to the audience through mirrors. But of course, we got some practice with that too in The Abominable Bride. When Sherlock called John in his last vow, did he reveal any additional information we didn't get to see?
It's Sherlock, John. Sherlock. John, you have to answer it.
My answer to this is probably not, based on the way John acts in the Baker Street confrontation. His emotional reaction there seems very genuine, in contrast to a couple of other later scenes that we'll be coming back to. I think this is also backed up by what we see in Sherlock's mind in The Abominable Bride. He suspects that John knows Mary is a villain, as we see through the situation with Lord and Lady Carmichael, but that's all it is, a suspicion. I don't think he would be able to talk himself out of his certainty that John is going to leave her otherwise.
I thought I was losing you.
Well, you're the one who moved out.
I was talking to Mary.
So I don't think Sherlock explained everything to John off screen, but This phone call does introduce that idea, that from this point on, we are not allowed to see how John and Sherlock discuss Mary when they're alone. That's still true in Series 4. Even on the surface, there are conversations John and Sherlock have, plans about how to outmaneuver Mary, that we aren't privy to.
In the memory stick.
Yeah, that was my idea.
Did John read the flash drive?
That's all I have to say. That's all I need to know.
Just purely based on the scene where we get a replay of John promising to be the problems of Mary's future and throwing the flash drive into the fire, cutting to AJ talking about how much he wants revenge on Mary because of her past.
The problems of your future are my privilege.
You know, you do, don't you? You know the bitch.
AJ says signs point to yes. What did John learn when he read the flash drive?
So many lies. And I don't just mean you.
Every day as they tore into me,
Here's where we begin to diverge from the direction I took things in my version of Series 4. I had John knowing almost nothing going into Series 4, mostly for thematic purposes, because I wanted his emotional conflict, being stuck wondering if Sherlock was telling the truth or lying, wanting desperately to believe in Sherlock, but not allowing himself to really consider it, because he knows he couldn't bear to be wrong, to mirror the reader's experience of wondering about Sherlock the show. And in the wish fulfillment version, John gets to be right, and right by the end of Act 4. So if the ending resonated with you, I think that's why. I wrote it in a way that I hoped would provide you with catharsis on multiple levels, even if you didn't consciously realize that was happening. You see what I'm saying about writing not being accidental. But it would seem that Series 4 of BBC Sherlock is trying to make a different thematic point than I was. One about John underplaying his own involvement, as the original Watson did, and in the way the majority of Holmes fans discount Watson as a vital part of the story. This series shows you that without John, the story doesn't work nearly as well, and it demonstrates how Watson has been underselling himself all along. So in order to figure out what John knows, we can't just look to John, who's claiming that he never read the flash drive. Instead, and all together now, cherchez les mémoires. In this case, our friend AJ.
She betrayed me. Betrayed us all.
Mary. This is about Mary.
I think the setting of the scene where we learn that AJ is after revenge on Mary is an important clue, because we see that John associates the reveal of Mary's past with a standoff at a pool. And doesn't that sound familiar?
Don't be silly. Someone else is holding the rifle. I don't like getting my hands dirty.
So it would seem that John knows that Mary was at the pool that night. But here we come to another dilemma, because the other major reason I had the flash drive being empty in my version is that I find the idea of Mary genuinely carrying around a flash drive full of incriminating information sort of laughable. There were hints that it could be empty. This treasure has the letters Agra scrawled on it, and in canon, the Agra treasure was empty by the time Holmes and Watson found it. Hey guys, editing Rebecca here. So in capturing the paragraph that you can see on screen here, I think the text here is additional evidence that this might actually be what happened. Not only is the Agra treasure empty, but when Jonathan Small realizes this, he is obsessed with getting revenge on the person who stole it. The text goes so far as to say that from that day on, he lived only for vengeance, thought of it by day and nursed it by night, which sounds an awful lot like our friend AJ. But John does appear to have learned at least some of Mary's past. So either that information was genuinely on the flash drive, or John got that information some other way. And I think there is a plausible alternative. It's very possible that John works out that Mycroft, not knowing that Mary shot Sherlock, not knowing about her past, is a bit of a smoking gun.
4 top international assassins relocate to within spitting distance of 221B.
If this was Moriarty, we'd be dead already.
If not Moriarty, then who?
So it could be that he got his information after confronting Mycroft. I think that bit happens regardless. This is an idea that comes up in all 3 episodes, getting the truth out of Mycroft. There's the scene where Sherlock accuses Mycroft of knowing Mary's true identity, and he sort of smugly shrugs it off as not being a big deal.
But you know all that.
Of course I do. Come on.
Mary, also one of the team.
Indeed. Well, that's news to me.
Is it?
And a few more where John is the one to confront Mycroft over his past actions, his failure to intervene to save Sherlock.
You said it didn't the last time, and it wouldn't with Sherlock. So who was it the last time? Who are you talking about? I misspoke.
He's lying.
You're lying.
Well, someone convinced him that you wouldn't tell the truth unless you were actually wetting yourself.
Someone.
Probably me.
Since I'm still focused on finding the best possible version of this story, as I see it, this is the explanation I'm leaning towards. The flash drive was empty. Everything John knows, he learns from Mycroft. It would also explain the rather glaring holes in John's knowledge, things that almost certainly would have been on Mary's flash drive had it been genuine. The double meaning of AJ being tortured while his captors chant ammo, amo, is a hint about the dual nature of John and Mary's relationship.
Amo, amas, amat.
I love, you love, he loves, what?
Not ammo is in ammunition, but amo meaning...
That Mary said it was for love, and it might have been, at least partially, but it was also on someone else's orders.
They took me, tortured me. Not for information, not for anything except fun.
Ammo! Ammo!
It would break him and I would lose him forever. And Sherlock, I will never let that happen.
I just kept picking up things.
What would you do to a traitor?
Let's stick with that torture scene for a moment, because AJ isn't alone. Here we get one of the few Sherlock mirrors in the series, Alexander, also kidnapped, also tortured, strung up kind of like how Sherlock was in the empty hearse.
They tortured Alex to death. I could still hear the sound of his back breaking.
If this is implying that John knows about Sherlock being tortured, then the fact that Mycroft supplies John with this information when he asks about Mary would also seem to imply that she was connected to this somehow. Which leads to our next question. Who did Mary work for? I mean, you already know what I'm going to say. Mary is given Sebastian Moran's only scene from the empty house in his last vow.
The empty houses. I wanted in a card game with the Clarence House cannibal. Quite a gambler, that woman.
Dummy. I suppose that was a fairly obvious trick.
Sherlock is convinced that Mary is working for an M. There's this story, which if it's an idea that John is trying to dismiss rather than the writers...
Have you ever wondered if your wife was a little bit out of your league? Well, you thought she was having an affair. I'm afraid it's far worse than that. Your wife is a spy.
Well, that's telling. There's the deadly assassin lurking nearby, immediately before Mary calls 59 times. We have this blatant connection from Sherlock.
I was so convinced it was Moriarty, I couldn't see what was right under my nose.
In that same scene, Sherlock asks Mary who she worked for.
There was a change of plan, a last-minute adjustment.
Who from?
I don't know, just another voice on the phone.
That line is said quite a few times in relation to Mary this episode, actually, that people shouldn't trust a voice on the other end of the phone, which is a line you should recognize.
Oh, come on, Kitty. No one trusts the voice at the end of a telephone.
Well, there was never any real contact. Just messages. Whispers.
And did those whispers have a name?
There's Mary sending a Miss Me DVD and then saying this.
The game is on. Do you still miss me?
And the way her final Miss You PS message parallels the post-credits scene of The Final Problem that shows in some versions, but not all.
PS.
Surprise. You didn't think I'd just disappear, did you?
And so it seems like there really only is one conclusion. The same one we came to before. Who is Mary working for?
None other than James Moriarty.
Did John really forgive Mary?
I've thought long enough about what I want to say to you. These are prepared words, Mary. I've chosen these words with care.
Well, considering it looks very likely that John knows that Mary worked for Moriarty...
The problems of your future are my privilege.
Is it too early for a divorce? She was wrong about me.
Do you trust your wife? Do you trust her? You know the bitch.
Mary, I'm sorry to tell you this, but he wants you dead.
I've dreamed of killing you. Squeezing the life out of your treacherous, lying throat.
I swear to you, AJ.
AJ says, signs point to no. How much does Mycroft know?
But that's not possible. That is simply not possible. Impossible.
Nothing's impossible. You of all people know.
As ever, Mycroft knows everything. He is leagues ahead of Sherlock and John, and caught up in games beyond their comprehension. I mean, he is the writers.
Oh, good. I love an acronym. All the best secret societies have them.
It's the fact that he's holding a pen that's the worst thing about that, I've decided. Wallops me in the face every time. Like, We get it, Mark. If we're assuming that we're dealing with M theory here, and I always am, then John is aware at the very least that Mycroft was genuinely compromised during the events of Reichenbach. He knows Mycroft has let Sherlock down in the past.
It didn't the last time, and I assure you it won't with Sherlock.
And John makes the connection specifically back to Reichenbach in his story, with Mycroft giving Moriarty pieces of Sherlock's backstory that no one but him could have told.
And Moriarty didn't get this stuff from me. John. So how does it work then, your relationship? You go out for a coffee now and then, hey? You and Jim?
With me? She has noted your interest in the activities of my little brother.
When confronted, Mycroft admits at least part of his guilt.
This is my fault. Moriarty.
Moriarty.
You have no idea what you're dealing with. None at all.
But I think it's very likely that he still isn't telling John the whole story.
This is a lie.
Yes. This is the story I told our parents to spare them further pain and to account for the absence of an identifiable body.
Put a pin in that. Why doesn't Mycroft act?
She's very clever.
I'm beginning to think you're not.
Well, I think he is, sort of. We'll talk about this in a bit, but someone brought back Moriarty on the TV screens, and whoever it was had Mycroft's help. But why doesn't he act more directly? Well...
He did his best.
Then he's very limited.
The same reason Mycroft hasn't been able to act all along, because Mark and Stephen haven't. Yet. For now, he's still working in silence behind the scenes. And who is stopping him? Is Moriarty dead?
You and me, Sherlock, and our problem, the final problem. Staying alive!
If you know how I read Moriarty thematically, you already know my answer. We learn two things in The Abominable Bride. Amelia Ricoletti shot herself in the mouth and lived. And...
Moriarty's dead.
And yet...
His body was never recovered.
And as we just saw, that idea comes up again in Series 4.
To account for the absence of an identifiable body.
And I'll remind you what Stephen Moffat had to say about that trick. He knows what it means when the body isn't recovered from a body of water where it would float. So he knew perfectly well that he was leaving the door open to Sherlock Holmes' return, but he wanted to do other things for a while. Then there's the Christmas Day 5 years ago paradox, where every possible date that scene between Mycroft and Moriarty could take place on is the wrong one. I think that's a hint that Mycroft and Moriarty met more than once, before John and Sherlock met, while they knew each other, and... most critically, after Sherlock jumped off the roof of St. Bart's. And again, there's that weird post-credits scene that is in some versions, but not in others.
Surprise. You didn't think I'd just disappear, did you?
Thematically, and in terms of these clues, it seems like Moriarty is still very much alive. And in my opinion, that's a good thing. So much of the plot that they had set up in the first 10 episodes relies on Moriarty still being around to pull it all together. I think it would be silly to throw that aside. So Moriarty is alive, Mycroft knows, and John doesn't. And that nicely leads us to the question The Abominable Bride left off on. How much does Sherlock know?
Moriarty is dead. No question. But more importantly, I know exactly what he's going to do next.
Short answer, not much. My answer to this question is about identical to the one presented in From a Drop of Water, because we get all the information we need in Tab. Sherlock is completely convinced that Moriarty is dead. He thinks Mary and Mycroft are working together.
You're working for Mycroft?
He likes to keep an eye on his mad sibling.
We had a spy to hand.
Because, like John, he's aware that Mycroft must know Mary shot him. If he thinks Moriarty is dead, then the only possible reason for that is that Mycroft and Mary are accomplices. And for the vast majority of Sherlock's dream, it seems like he has a pretty good idea of who is behind Moriarty's return. We see this in the Carmichael case, with Sir Eustace, the Mary Mirror, being haunted by something from her past.
Eustace, what does this mean?
Death. It means death.
Sherlock is adamant that there is only one person who would have the motive, means, and opportunity for this particular crime.
There is only one suspect with motive and opportunity. This is the work of a single-minded person, someone who knew firsthand about Sir Eustace's mental cruelty. Isn't that right, Lady Carmichael?
If Eustace is Mary and Lady Carmichael is John, it seems like Sherlock is under the impression that John is the one behind Moriarty's return. But he eventually dismisses the idea because he can't see how John bringing him back to England would factor into that plan.
Why engage me to prevent a murder you intended to commit?
After that, Sherlock seems to suspect that Mary is the one behind Moriarty's return, as demonstrated in the Mary-Moriarty mirroring we get after that point.
You're dreaming.
Is he dreaming?
We see throughout this episode that Sherlock is constantly doubting his read on Mary, thinking that maybe he's being too harsh on her, but he seems to talk himself around to her being a baddie by the end of the episode. We'll see in Series 4 that Sherlock is completely blindsided by the reveal of what was really going on. He thought he was looking for someone working with Moriarty. It turns out he was looking for someone wanting revenge on Mary.
Tell me about your boss, Moriarty. I know it's him. It must be him.
You think you understand? You understand nothing.
Given the fact that he's talking to AJ there, you might see where that's going. But we have a few more questions to get to before then. Why did Sherlock OD on the plane?
He was high before he got on the plane.
Every war has suicide missions, and make no mistake, this is war. I just went to the trouble of an overdose to prove it.
This one is pretty straightforward, but it's important to reestablish the answer before getting to the next few questions. Sherlock, despite what he says at the end of The Abominable Bride, does not overdose to prove a point about Moriarty. He overdoses because he knew he was being sent on a suicide mission.
Where are you actually going now?
Oh, some undercover work in Eastern Europe.
For how long?
6 months, my brother estimates.
An undercover assignment that would prove fatal to you in, I think, about 6 months.
He's never wrong.
And after how poorly his last attempt at undercover work went, he didn't want to draw out his suffering. He wanted his last memories to be his final moments with John, when he was finally going to tell him how he felt. But he backed out at the last moment, and instead pulled up John's blog and began reading the story of the day they met.
You've been reading John's blog? The story of how you met?
The day John described him as strangely likable and charming. The entry that had everyone assuming that John was in love. Thankfully, it seems like Sherlock does bounce back from that emotional part of things relatively quickly, and is ecstatic to have a second chance.
Hashtag, oh what a beautiful morning.
Look, not so long ago I was on a mission that meant certain death. My death. I'm just glad to be alive.
So that's something at least. I hope you liked the good news, because it's downhill from here. How does John react to Sherlock's OD?
For God's sake, this could kill you. You could die.
As we can see on the plane in The Abominable Bride, not very well. Let's look at a little more of this plane scene, where John goes from content and almost a bit smug to completely devastated. You'll notice Mycroft is quicker to catch on than John, but has a similar reaction.
Well, a somewhat shorter exile than we'd imagined, Brother Murray.
Oh, Sherlock.
No, it's not that. He goes into a sort of trance. I've seen him do it. Yapping. Sorry, did we interrupt your session?
Mycroft is also quick to come to his conclusion for what caused this.
This was my fault. A week in a prison cell, I should have realized.
Realized what?
That in your case, solitary confinement is locking you up with your worst enemy.
As I mentioned earlier, I read the drug plotline in The Lying Detective as John reflecting on Sherlock's overdose in The Abominable Bride. I think that's part of why the Six Thatchers mentions Sherlock's drug use, but then treats it like a joke, when the next episode is all about how serious the repercussions of Sherlock taking drugs are. You're meant to be annoyed and unsatisfied in the Six Thatchers, so you'll look for the plotline that fills in the gap, which The Lying Detective does. So John begins by wondering if this is all a ploy, like we just saw in his initial reaction.
Yeah, well, they're real enough, I suppose.
Why would I be faking?
Because you're a liar. You lie all the time. It's like your mission.
But looking at the mirrors, John seems to eventually arrive at the same conclusion Mycroft does, that this is all his fault. Not only is the person inspiring Sherlock's relapse on the surface a pretty obvious John mirror, Culverton Smith.
A mess, I'm in hell, but I am not wrong. Not about him.
So what has all this got to do with me?
But even in the story, the real reason for Sherlock's overdose is a miss me message that's all about John.
Go to hell, Sherlock. Go right into hell and make it look like you mean it. If he thinks you need him, I swear he will be there.
And as you saw there, that speech plays while Culverton is suffocating Sherlock. We talked in the very first part of the retrospective about murder methods as a metaphor. As far as murder metaphors go, smothering someone is about as blatant as you could get. I'll also point out that at the end of the Six Thatchers, something has happened that has John wanting to keep Sherlock at arm's length. That at that particular moment, he would rather see anyone but Sherlock.
It's
It's from John. He said that he'd rather have anyone but you. Anyone.
Now, you can say this does actually happen after the aquarium, as it first appears, but given that the scene with the joke about a jellyfish is one of the only in-character moments in the entire series, and one of the only scenes we get to actually see Sherlock and John alone, I think that scene does genuinely happen. Sherlock and John do probably go back to Baker Street together after whatever happened at the aquarium. So instead, it might be that John's letter, which we don't get to read, and Faith's letter, which is the central clue of the lying detective, are one and the same. The footage of Sherlock reading John's letter at the end of Thatcher's is also the same footage that was used when Sherlock was looking up information on the Moriarty plot much earlier. Another choice that seems to indicate that this bit happens before the standoff at the aquarium. So I submit that there's something else causing John to push Sherlock away. There are hints that John is terrified Sherlock looks at him and sees right through him.
Please remember where you're standing, because you're standing exactly where I said you would be 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago?
3.
I'm that predictable.
So it seems like John has done something that he thinks caused Sherlock's overdose. Something he wants desperately to hide. At this point, you almost certainly know where I'm taking that, so let's address the elephant in the room. Who brought back Moriarty, and why?
Once the idea exists, it cannot be killed. If one disregards the ghost, there is only one suspect.
This is probably the biggest difference between From a Drop of Water and what I think is going on in Series 4. If Moriarty is still alive, and it looks like Moriarty is back, it seemed like a no-brainer to me that he was the one behind his own return. But I don't think that's the case here, because there's no way to pull that out of the subtext of Series 4. It seems like Moriarty is still in stealth mode, watching the characters destroy themselves for the time being. And that checks out. While there was that post-credits footage of the real Moriarty in both His Last Vow and The Final Problem, in the show itself, we only see a still image of the back of his neck and the Miss Me gif. So if it's not Moriarty who took over every TV screen in the land, who did? Well, whoever it was would have needed some help.
One of you is a high-ranking police officer. One of you is a member of the judiciary. One of you sits on the board of a prominent broadcaster. 2 of you work for me.
In fact, if Culverton is standing in for whoever is behind Moriarty's return, it would also explain why he keeps hijacking the episode with those TV bites. John is associating the two.
Don't call us, we'll call.
I'm trying to sleep. Can you stop ringing my damn phone?
Of course, we also know that John is drawing mental parallels between the responsible party and Sherlock's definition of the best man.
There are charities that I support who wouldn't exist without me. If life is a balance sheet, and I think it is, well, I believe I'm in credit.
The best man. Billy Kincaid, the Camden Garrotter, best man ever, knew vast contributions to charity never disclosed. Yes, every now and again there'd be some garrottings, but stacking up the lives saved against the garrottings, on balance, I'd say.
But then again, Billy Kincaid isn't really the person Sherlock considers to be the best man, is he?
The best and bravest man I know, and on top of that, he actually knows how to do stuff.
So, yes. The reason Culverton's myth is what you get when you cross Moriarty and John's characters is because that's exactly what he is. John is the one behind Moriarty's return.
Can we be clear? Are you confessing?
To what?
Culverton isn't the only hint, though he's certainly the most blatant. We also have Charlie Wellsborough, using doctored footage to set up a happy surprise, one overlaid with rainbows, before everything goes wrong.
Oh my God! Surprise! Yeah!
You all right?
It's nothing. Probably just the altitude.
We have John confessing multiple times to being the one to orchestrate a plan behind the scenes.
In the memory stick.
Yeah, that was my idea.
Well, someone convinced him that you wouldn't tell the truth unless you were actually wetting yourself. Probably me.
And then there are the hints we got before Series 4 that I feel like I really ought to have noticed in retrospect. Because, as we established, Sherlock is convinced that John is the person behind Moriarty's return for almost the entire runtime of The Abominable Bride.
There is only one suspect. Isn't that right, Lady Carmichael?
And the Six Thatchers directly calls back to Sherlock's theory, probably a subtle hint that he and John talked about his theories, and that Sherlock actually had it right.
You promised to keep him safe, you promised.
You made a vow. You swore it.
And I never stopped to ask why Sherlock was so sure. I just sort of assumed that it was part of him repressing Moriarty. He's slotting John into it instead, like he does on the waterfall scene, and like convincing himself that Moriarty must be dead in general, when his case sort of naturally leads to the opposite conclusion. That's his coping mechanism. But I don't think I was giving Sherlock enough credit in this particular instance, because Sherlock is smart, and more importantly, Sherlock is observant. And that leads me to one of the most obvious tells, because it has always struck me as odd how much John is smiling during the tarmac scene. I could never make it fit his character, so I thought maybe it was a cheat, a way to downplay the seriousness of the love confession. I had it backwards. The love confession was the distraction from John here. Watch this scene as if John knows that Sherlock isn't actually going to be sent away forever, that the plane is immediately going to turn around, and suddenly, John smiling like the cat who ate the canary in the background makes much more sense. He thinks he's about to finally get one over on Sherlock, a small form of payback for all the times Sherlock has tricked him, including the most recent, when Sherlock lied to him about Mary's shot being surgery. He's sure Sherlock will forgive him. After all, Sherlock's always expecting John to just laugh off this kind of thing.
Yeah, I can't think of a single thing to say.
No, neither can I.
The man has no poker face. Sherlock might have made the right call not telling him he was alive, actually. John pushes Sherlock a bit to see if he can get him to be honest for once, and nearly gets a lot more than he bargained for.
Who knows? John, there's something I should say. I've meant to say always and I never have.
And it's only after Sherlock walks away, after that aborted declaration, that John finally looks more serious, like he's realizing what nearly just happened. To compound the guilt, he didn't just pull the train car trick in reverse. His attempt to outsmart Sherlock almost resulted in Sherlock's death. So when Sherlock gets off the plane and starts talking about how they need to take down whatever horrible person is behind Moriarty's return, thinking he's talking about Mary...
Dangerous, the most despicable human being that I have ever encountered. This monster must be ended.
So what has all this got to do with me?
That creature, that rotting thing, is a living, breathing coagulation of human evil.
Well, is it any wonder that John feels like a monster? Why did he do it? This is where Sherlock went wrong. He talked himself out of his theory because he assumed John's primary motivation was to get revenge on Mary, and he couldn't understand why John would bring him back for that.
Why engage me to prevent a murder you intended to commit?
He also has it the wrong way round. He doesn't want Sherlock to try to solve the murder. John's trying to save his life. Yes, part of this is reminding Mary the sins of her past.
You'd better wrap up warm. There's an east wind coming.
But the main reason? It was for Sherlock. He knew Sherlock was going to spend the rest of his life locked away without human contact, or else sent somewhere where he had utility, and so convinced Mycroft to help him orchestrate a plan to save him. And it all went wrong.
This was my fault.
What were you doing to him? What were you doing?
He's in distress. I'm helping him.
Restrain him now. Do it.
I was trying to help him.
Sherlock, what was he doing to you?
Suffocating me, overdosing me.
The one time John tries to be clever, it blows up in his face. That is sort of what happens when you introduce Moriarty to the story you're telling, symbolically speaking. Are John and Sherlock working together?
Did you bring your gun as I suggested?
Why would I bring my gun to your parents' house for Christmas dinner?
Is it in your coat?
Yes.
Before the tarmac? Almost certainly not. After the tarmac? For the first bit of Series 4, I would also say that the answer is no. We've already seen that Sherlock is actively pursuing someone he thinks is working with Moriarty before being literally hit with the revelation that he's gotten it wrong. Looking at the mirrors, it seems like John and Sherlock did actually have some kind of confrontation over this. We get hints of an altercation in all 3 episodes. And the 3 most obvious scenes all involve Sherlock trying to get a confession out of a John mirror. I would even say that the explosion in Baker Street gives a hint for where this fight might have actually happened. Now, I'm not convinced that this fight actually got physical. If it did, it's almost certain that John is heightening what actually happened, showing that he felt like he completely lost control. Or the entire thing is a metaphor for an emotional conflict. Either way, they fight, and the truth finally comes out. I do think we have evidence that after this point, Sherlock agrees to help John with his plan. In The Six Thatchers, he sends Mary 2 ominous texts that I think are one and the same, designed to lure her to the aquarium.
That was quite a text you sent me. What's going on, Sherlock? Can you tell me later?
Yeah.
And Mary isn't the only one he's texting. And of course, there's the fact that in those 2 John has a plan scenes I keep playing, Sherlock is in on the plan in both instances.
But they're really difficult, since that I just stuck a tracer on the inside of the memory stick.
Yeah, that was my idea.
Hey, bro.
Why would he do that to me? That was insane. Well, someone convinced him that you wouldn't tell the truth unless you were actually wetting yourself.
So, yes, Sherlock and John are finally working together, and even sort of communicating. If only we got to actually see it, huh? Is Mycroft working with them?
A lot of planets going to crash.
What is this? We can't do this.
Do shut up, dear.
Someone there.
Is this supposed to be a game?
Yes. He was working with John initially. He's in on the plan. He's also notably present at the aquarium, so he's still working with them by the end of the series. The fact that the entirety of the final problem centers around John, Sherlock, and Mycroft going against a dangerous woman, a woman whom Mycroft has more connections to than he's letting on, seems like more evidence in favor. Along with those promotional images, where the 3 of them are sat round a table planning, Mycroft and Sherlock begin playing chess as John watches on, before Sherlock knocks away the board. There are schemes and plans and games afoot. As always, though, I think it's very likely that Mycroft is keeping some information back, and I worry that he might be being forced to play both sides. He was playing against Sherlock in that chess game, after all. Before I provide a rough sketch of the events that might be unfolding in Series 4, I just want to mention a few other Mirror characters I haven't touched on as much yet, and explain how I read them. I hinted at this with the letter, but I read Faith as another John Mirror, as I think you are pretty clearly intended to do. The mysterious E John begins texting after a montage of Sherlock texting someone, mentioning deleting John's texts, and texting John immediately before this text affair allegedly starts, is Sherlock. This is clearly Sherlock. John's note with the phone number even says he's texting an ex. Also, I didn't mention this in the Series 4 recap, but this phone number, most of it is a sort of standard template for British phone numbers on TV, kind of like 1-800 here in the US. But those last 3 numbers, well, if you pull out your phone number pad, you might notice that one of the few legible messages you can get out of them is JLC. Mark does love an acronym. Mary's an odd one. Like I complained about at length in the Series 4 recap, she seems to have been sort of wedged uncomfortably into the center of the story, like she's standing in for either John or Sherlock, depending on the specific scene and who she's talking to. You're left trying to piece together what's going on from the context clues. But while you might think that I wouldn't like the woolly nature of this mirror, it's actually an excellent callback to the way that Doyle uses Mary Morstan in the canon, particularly in The Sign of the Four, where several scenes read like Watson has just placed Mary Morstan where Holmes should be. And all of this happens after the novel opens with Holmes complaining about the romance present in the first story, Watson insisting that the romance was there, he couldn't alter the facts, and Holmes declaring that some facts ought to be suppressed. And suppress them Watson does, using Miss Morstan. People argue that romance in the Victorian era didn't mean what it means today, that this refers to the Romantic movement, the focus on the spontaneous, the irrational, the emotional. But the Romantic movement did very much include stories and pieces about romantic love, and the full line from Holmes only makes this more clear. You have attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which produces much the same effect as if you had worked a love story or an elopement in the 5th proposition of Euclid, which these writers know.
Now, it's come to my attention that it is 10 years since a highly fictionalized account of my brother's adventures was brought to the screen. This was a mistake. These programs have attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which has rather the same effect as if one were to work a love story or an elopement into the 5th proposition of Euclid. However, in their defense, the one who plays me is very handsome.
Anyway, I got a bit off track there. My point was, using Mary as a mechanism to suppress the love story, specifically John Watson inserting Mary into a story to conceal his feelings for Sherlock Holmes, goes all the way back to the second Holmes novel. I find Eurus a bit trickier to pin down as a mirror character. One of the ideas most commonly thrown around in Series 4 meta discussion is the connection between the dual meaning of ammo and amo to Eurus being a play on Eros, the god of love. And I'll sort of be revisiting that idea in the final section. For now, yes, you can read Eurus as a twisted version of John's desires, kind of like Culverton Smith.
She?
Afraid I didn't notice in the heat of the moment.
Stop me getting it!
No. Stop me in a minute.
Considering that in the end, she's locked away in a glass prison, and Sherlock can visit her through the glass, but not speak to or touch her, does make reading her that way sort of excruciating to think about. But she isn't just a dark reflection of John. She also repeats some of Sherlock's most troubling actions.
This is an experiment. There will be rigor.
I had to. It was an experiment.
An experiment?
It's a sort of experiment.
You're not an experiment, Sherlock.
No, I know you're not an experiment. You're my friend.
Another one of your bloody tricks. No. You're just trying to make me say something nice.
And the aforementioned idea of John, Sherlock, and Mycroft teaming up to try to defeat a highly dangerous woman using deception and getting caught in an emotionally complicated game would seem to indicate that there's a bit of Mary in here too. Like so much of Series 4, it depends on
context.
So those are our pieces. Let's finish this section by trying to put together the story. Or, more accurately, let's play the game. It doesn't take long for John to decide to read the flash drive. He finds it empty. He doesn't talk to Sherlock about it because it's clear that whatever Sherlock is planning, that plan involves keeping John in the dark. He quickly puts together the pieces that Mycroft must know who shot Sherlock, and about Mary's past. He knew about all those assassins just moving into Baker Street in the Reichenbach Fall after all. How could he not know who Mary is? So John confronts Mycroft over his involvement. Mycroft, racked with guilt, partially confesses. He reveals Mary worked for Moriarty, that he was remaining silent out of fear of putting them in danger, and agrees to work with John to take her down. But he's also holding back some key information. In the lead up to Christmas, Sherlock orchestrates the family get-together, and both John and Mycroft know he's planning something. Probably a way to take care of Magnuson. He told John that was his priority. Sherlock asking John to bring his gun only confirms that this is his plan. So John scripts his forgiveness speech, since it looks like Sherlock wants him to reconcile with Mary, and Mycroft makes sure to bring his very important laptop and draw attention to where it is. John enjoys being in on the plan for once, although he is a bit concerned about Sherlock drugging Mary while she's pregnant. But everything goes wrong at Magnuson's. There are no vaults, Sherlock has no plan, and as a last resort, he shoots Magnuson to keep John safe.
Oh, Sherlock. What have you done?
It's looking dire, but John has an idea. The authorities can't lock Sherlock away or send him off to his death if they need him. So he asks Mycroft to help it make it look like Moriarty has returned. Reluctantly, Mycroft agrees. John doesn't really question the explanation Mycroft gives for having footage of Moriarty lying around.
How can that be Moriarty?
Oh, he recorded lots of little messages for me before he died.
It might also be at this point that John learns about the other Holmes sibling, because Mycroft plans to use it as his cover. He's not given to outbursts of brotherly compassion and all. John arrives at the tarmac, thinking he's finally outsmarted Sherlock for once, and he's proud of himself for finding a way to save Sherlock's life. But then Sherlock says something that sounds like him trying to tell John that he's in love with him, then nearly overdoses, and when he comes to, he's smiling at John like he's the best thing in the world, and oh God, Sherlock can never know this was John, but he's terrified that he already does. Surprisingly, he doesn't, and John's guilt begins eating away at him. He's overcome with this need to confess to what he's done. John and Mycroft talk about why Sherlock would have taken such extreme measures, and John blames himself for not seeing this coming. Mycroft insists on keeping the plan quiet, most likely on someone else's orders. John writes something. Maybe an actual letter, maybe a blog post, where he hints at what he's done. Sherlock reads it, but doesn't pick up on the most important hints until later. Instead, he seems thrilled to be back with John, although he keeps brushing close to very dangerous topics, things they never talk about.
Sex. How did you know I wasn't getting any?
Sherlock is still acting differently. He has been ever since he woke up on the plane, and John notices. Sherlock might try to dismiss it.
Well, that's interesting.
What is?
The way you think.
Superbly.
Sweetly.
I'm not sweet, I'm just high.
Sherlock begins investigating, trying to prove that it was Mary behind Moriarty's return. It doesn't take Sherlock long to realize his mistake, and the revelation is a messy one. I think the two most likely scenarios here are that Sherlock either continues pushing and pushing his idea of what happened, or that he comes around to his original theory on his own and confronts John. Either way, the truth explodes out of John in a burst of anger. John then runs off, not wanting Sherlock to know his real motivations for what he did. Sherlock is initially left reeling, but quickly decides he deserved it after everything he's put John through. He apologizes for that. He doesn't blame John at all for his overdose. He promises to keep John safe as long as they work together.
I don't deserve you. All I ever wanted to do was keep you and Rosie safe, that's all.
I will keep you safe.
This declaration only makes John's guilt worse. But the two begin working together, mostly over text, to avoid suspicion from Mary. The texts get flirty very quickly, only adding to John's conflicted feelings. Sherlock can't really mean it. He must feel like he owes John in some misguided way. It's so easy to pretend, though. He gets caught up in it. He can't stop thinking about confessing to everything now that he's had a taste for it. Sherlock found out what he did and forgave him, and now they're closer than they've been in years. Maybe he could tell Sherlock he loves him and it would be okay. Maybe Sherlock does love him back. He's wondered so many times. Then again, maybe the entire thing is a trick. John's not the only one who lies. There was a reason he thought his stunt with Moriarty would be okay. Sherlock is always lying to him. If Sherlock wanted anyone, it would be someone like Irene Adler, or more likely, no one at all. Sherlock is so vulnerable and good, and has clearly been hurt by something. John confessing would only hurt him again. It would be better off for everyone if he remained silent. John oscillates between his guilt over what's going on with Sherlock and his hatred for Mary, pushing all of his feelings into planning her downfall. Something moves the plan forward, and Sherlock sends the lure for Mary. He tells John the time and the place, and John tells Mycroft and Lestrade to go to the London Aquarium, which leads to our final question. What happened at the aquarium?
Because, said Death, I had an appointment with you tonight in Samara.
The confrontation does not go well. The plan was probably just to arrest Mary. They do still think she's pregnant after all. Mary doesn't play along, pulling out a gun. John and Mary are locked in a standoff. Mary's facade completely drops, and she threatens John.
You know I'll kill you too. You know I will, AJ.
But you think I care if I die? I've dreamed of killing you, squeezing the life out of your treacherous, lying throat.
I swear to you, AJ.
Eventually, someone fires. John presents the idea that he was the one who was shot in this confrontation, both through AJ's death and in the scene at the end of The Lying Detective, although the latter is walked back at the start of the final problem. The issue with taking that at face value is that I can't quite figure out how he would be able to write these events if he was genuinely shot and bleeding out here. So instead, I'm reading those scenes as an expression of John feeling like he ought to have died. I think this is supported by the footage of the gunshot that kills Mary and the gunshot that John receives at the end of The Lying Detective being one and the same. There was only one gunshot. So John wasn't shot. He was the one doing the shooting. John is the one who kills Mary.
I say jealousy was your motive after all. To prove how good you are. To make up for the inadequacies of your little life.
Maybe I can still surprise you. Surprise!
Or, at the very least, he thinks he does. I think it's possible that Mary fakes her death here. Maybe they discover that she wasn't really pregnant. Maybe Mycroft whisks the body away before they can examine it too closely. And now there's another crime to cover up. John will need an alibi. I think the repeated scenes of John or John mirrors in interrogation rooms might be a reference to this point, where they develop the cover story. We go immediately from the scene of AJ and Mary's standoff to Lady Smallwood being brought brought in for questioning. The alternative is that John gets taken in for questioning much earlier, around the time of his fight with Sherlock, as we go from Sherlock trying to get Culverton to confess to John being interrogated by Lestrade. The interrogation scene in The Final Problem could lean towards either reading, since it comes after back-to-back scenes of the explosion in Baker Street, which I read as being symbolic of their fight, followed by a scene of John pointing his gun at someone. Or maybe John is interrogated more than once. Regardless, in the aftermath, John is more horrified with himself than he thought he would be in the build-up. Maybe that's part of what scares him, the loathing he felt for Mary in that moment, his own lack of hesitation. More proof that deep down, he's a monster, maybe just like his Thatcher-loving father. It seems to John that the world really would be better off without him in it. Sherlock, of course, blames himself for things going wrong, which doesn't make John feel any better. Maybe John lets Sherlock persuade him to come back to Baker Street, which is my read, based on both the jellyfish scene and the fact that the final scene of John's story shows that Sherlock and John are back in Baker Street, but things are still wrong between them, with Mary literally looming over them. But maybe he shuts himself away in his empty house instead. John thinks back to his life before Sherlock. The last time he felt this suicidal. What had he done then? What had pulled him out? Well, Sherlock. But John can't ask anything else of him. But there was also Ella's suggestion. The reason he has a blog to begin with was to help him process what's happened to him. And so John begins writing. And that's my take on it. I am almost 100% sure that this is not entirely accurate. Even if blog theory is the correct approach, I think I'm probably still missing things. I've seen Series 4 less than 10 times. I don't know it nearly as well as I know the rest of the show. But I think this reading ties together most of the subtext and the mirrors I'm seeing to be in the general ballpark of what might be happening. Now, how all of this might be revealed to the audience is another matter. I try not to dwell on the specifics of a good Series 5. I feel like that's setting myself up for disappointment, even in a best case scenario. I already might be shooting myself in the foot by leaning as hard as I am into the Moriarty plot. But I think me trying not to be disappointed if Moriarty doesn't come back is a bit of a lost cause, so it can't be helped. I will say though that one element of 5-act structure that I haven't mentioned, parallel structure or narrative mirroring, does provide a hint for how we might get the truth. The idea with narrative mirroring is that you fold the story in half at the midpoint to create a slope on either side peaking in the middle. And if you go along an equal distance on either side of the mountain, you'll find matching or mirroring points on the narrative. You might have seen me posting some of these on Tumblr. Honestly, I started doing them as a joke and then found way more than I expected to. Here are some highlights. So we start the Sign of 3 with Sherlock dancing alone. We end the Sign of 3 with Sherlock watching John and Mary dance. There's a scene towards the start of the empty hearse that has Sherlock surrounded by soldiers and helicopters, resulting in his capture and subsequent return to London. And at the end of his last vow, we see that same scenario play out again, but now he's going to be sent away. Many happy returns and the abominable bride counteract the unbalancing the other might cause, both occurring during Sherlock's time away on either side of the midpoint. The Reichenbach fall ends with Sherlock going along with Moriarty's lie as part of Mycroft's plan, and The Six Thatchers opens with Mycroft constructing an official version that isn't the true one. The Six Thatchers ends with Sherlock questioning if he can avoid his fate, and The Reichenbach fall opens by telling us that Sherlock is going to die, when we later learn that he doesn't. The reveal of Eurus at the end of The Lying Detective matches the scene of Henry Knight flashing back to his own childhood trauma, an explanation Sherlock later calls boring. And perhaps my favorite, the miss you message at the end of The Final Problem matches a scene at the start of A Scandal in Belgravia with Moriarty saying,
"You'll be hearing from me, Sherlock."
And so considering the whirlwind of reveals and thematic statements that the beginning of a good Series 5 would require, I do find it quite encouraging that the match point for the introduction to Series 5 is the pool scene from The Great Game, the scene that first made the thematic conflict at the heart of the story explicit. That would do it. They could even show a bit at the aquarium to tie back to the water-filled setting. My favorite detail in this regard is the fact that the pool scene includes a moment where Sherlock thinks John is is Moriarty, only to reveal the real one. That ties in pretty well. The audience could get the reveal that John had brought back Moriarty to save Sherlock, only to be hit with the gut punch that Moriarty isn't actually dead. But again, I try not to get my heart set on any specifics. Apart from one thing. If John Watson is stabbed in the heart at any point, but especially as the Gyarados moment, I win BBC Sherlock. Those are the official rules. Leaving that aside, that is a crash course on understanding Series 4 through blog theory. There are links in the description below for some other metas you might consider checking out, both for blog theory and EMP. But with all of those basics out of the way, I can finally get to the bit that I actually want to talk about. I've mentioned that looking back on it, I feel that perhaps we should have seen this direction for Series 4 coming. There are a few different reasons for that. Now that I've noticed that the way satire is used across the narrative, along with the writer's consistent technique of constantly contradicting themselves to keep the audience unsure, especially after what seems like a clear statement of thematic intent, yeah, really, what else were these guys going to do after the end of The Abominable Bride? But most of the foreshadowing I see in retrospect involves the meta plot, the allegory being told through M-theory. Revisiting that reading in light of Series 4 reveals a mess of warnings for what was to come. Now, again, bear in mind, this is still me playing the game. I am aware that all of this might be reading too much into details that might just be plot holes, but it is also very possible to weave these threads together into a better story. That story centers on a seemingly undefeatable foe, a careful plan laid in secret, and, of course, a plane that needs to land.
Look how brilliant you are. Your mind has created the perfect metaphor.
The Coventry Conundrum. What do you think of my solution?
Coventry all over again. The wheel turns, nothing is ever new.
Your very first case. And the final.
Approximately 15 years ago, two men sat chatting together in a train carriage. The conversation turned to their shared love of Sherlock Holmes, and how they both had the same two favorite adaptations, the Basil Rathbone Nigel Bruce version, which had brought Sherlock Holmes into the modern day, and The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. They spoke at length about the possibilities bringing Holmes into the modern day once again would provide, how someone was bound to do it eventually. They lamented the fact that someone else was going to get to tell that version first. But, as luck would have it, they were wrong. Those men were given the chance to tell their version. And not just that, the BBC took one look at their initial go at the story and offered them the opportunity to rework the series into something much more intricate. The kind of story that would offer the landmark representation the BBC was looking for at the time. And so Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat began planning a very long game. One that would use its narrative to draw attention to the fact that this would be the first version to get it right. I think you all know how I read most of the characters involved with M-theory at this point. I've been alluding to these ideas throughout, but here's a brief refresher all the same. Moriarty stands in for the people Mark and Stephen set out to correct. The people getting it wrong. Holmes fans and Holmes storytellers who completely dismiss the point of the Holmes stories, or, worse still, see the point and ignore it. More than that, he's the corrupting influence that has been at work in the stories all along, the virus in its data. Moriarty was chosen for this role because, in addition to being the most well-known Holmes villain, he was also the tool Doyle used to kill off Holmes. Maybe because he, too, was tired of people not getting the point and was frustrated that he couldn't be more explicit. Mary, as established a bit earlier, is an extension of this, a character added specifically to suppress the romance. Considering that it looks very likely that Mark and Stephen have also made her into Miranda, they clearly think that's part of the problem, a concession Doyle had to make in order to be able to tell this story. She's also an instrument of Moriarty, his right-hand man in the suppression of the true story. The way they use her, especially in Series 4, supports the idea that this is how they read her. She's shoved into the middle of the story, made into the most important element, and you're meant to say, hang on, I thought this was about John and Sherlock's relationship. The various sketchy characters involved in the media are another part of the critique, maybe on how easy it is to present a lie as the truth, or maybe it's these writers commenting on the business of making stories and on being in the public eye. And Mycroft, of course, is a proxy for the writers. They made a deal with the devil, agreed to tell their story in this excessively meta fashion, aligning themselves with the villains, for now, playing a key role in silencing any hint that there's a deeper plan, all in service of their end goals. Mycroft's role in all of this is the bit that makes me the most frustrated with my former optimism with regard to the writers, because Mycroft is constantly being berated, treated as weak, as heartless, and even as a genuine force for evil at times, willing to go to any means to justify his ends. And back in 2016, I looked at that bit of the subtext and thought, man, these guys are being way too harsh on themselves. The interviews are discouraging, sure, but they aren't that bad. But in light of Series 4, now I feel that if this reading is intended, they perhaps were not being hard enough on themselves through Mycroft. Like, even some of the stuff in Series 4...
You're lying.
I assure you I'm not.
He really is lying.
Get out of my house, you reptile.
I suppose there is a heart somewhere inside me. I don't imagine it's much of a target, but why don't we try for that?
This is my fault, huh?
He did his best.
Then he's very limited.
That still might not be harsh enough, actually. But while they perhaps suspected Series 4 would spark a negative reaction, I don't think they saw the full extent of the fallout coming. They seem to have lowered in their own esteem since the release of the final problem.
You have found the devil.
This is devilry. It is the devil.
Johnny, you're like me.
I am not like you.
I win. The last thing your eyes will ever see is the contempt in mine.
You came to me with a program, a plan, some genuinely fresh initiatives for, let's call it what it is, world domination.
One does not hurry such a vintage. I've been making you last.
I do sometimes wonder what it is that you actually want.
I call you ashamed. The game is over. You lose. You will live forever in shame.
Yep, that's more like it. I have forgiven them regardless of what they actually meant, half for my own sake and half because I really love what they did with this allegory in Dracula. But if they hadn't cast themselves as the literal devil, this would probably be a very different retrospective. But the warning signs have always been there. Right from the beginning, we're led to question Mycroft's motivations. Specifically, we're led to believe he's Moriarty, another storyteller getting it wrong.
If we made Mycroft, in fact, literally call himself his arch enemy, that people would fall for the idea that it was Moriarty, not Mycroft. And if I played it, people would assume I'd want to play Professor Moriarty. So that was part of it. And also, we'd started talking from the beginning about how, like Peter Mandelson, Mycroft would be as a sort of power behind the throne.
We're asked to question if we and the writers are on the same side. Sherlock, who at times stands in for the show itself, seems convinced that they aren't, because of something he's done in the past. In M Theory, Natty speculates that this rift was caused by whatever happened with the other one. And in one of my more daring speculations, I said that in the context of Mycroft standing in for writers who want to tell the love story between Holmes and Watson, the other one causing the rift would be a failed attempt to tell it. At the time, I specifically identified the private life of Sherlock Holmes. And in rewatching the final problem...
It's a Stradivarius.
It's a gift.
Who from?
Me.
Here. Take it. Madame says it is yours.
But a Stradivarius? You're not serious.
Well, that was a nice surprise to find on my initial rewatch. I think I may have made it a bit too specific, though. The other one isn't just private life. Eurus is Eros, the love story that has been suppressed. Locked in a prison called Sharonford, Sherlock's original name, his original identity, who he was meant to be, and never touched, never handled, kept in a cell made of glass.
Some things aren't supposed to sit behind glass. They're made to be touched, to be handled.
Oh, Sherlock, you know nothing. Touch the glass, and I'll tell you the truth.
Now, keep in mind during this discussion that I'm not saying that Eurus is real after all, just analyzing her symbolic role in the story being presented. John Watson being the one to add in this particular manifestation of the untold story adds another layer of implications, both for his character and how he views his own desires, and for the way the writers view Watson's role as the narrator of the home stories. You'll see with this lens that the ending of the final problem actually becomes surprisingly hopeful. In John's story, Mycroft is the one who put Eurus in her cell, and was the one to introduce Moriarty to this untold love story, corrupting both. Moriarty became part of that story, being one of the most explicitly queer elements on Sherlock, and the story they hoped to tell became sort of a villain unto itself, a last enemy to defeat. Every time Mycroft says everything is his fault, he's correct. In some ways, he's the ultimate villain of this story. He's the one who enables the rest to be so successful. But Mark and Steven couldn't resist the chance to play the game, even as they seemed to recognize that it was a morally grey choice to make.
Ready to play?
Play what? It's a 50-50 chance.
You're not playing the numbers, you're playing me. Is it a bluff? Or a double bluff? Or a triple bluff? Come on. Play the game.
The Blind Banker focuses on introducing the techniques the writers will be using throughout the rest of the show. Locked rooms, climaxes where the villain threatens to pierce the heart of Sherlock's love interest.
You've seen the act before. How dull for you. You know how it ends.
Mirrors, secret messages in a book that anyone would own, artifacts of cultural significance kept behind glass when they should be used to make tea, and codes. This world runs on codes.
The world's run on codes and ciphers, John. But it's all computer-generated, electronic codes, electronic ciphering methods. This is different. It's an ancient device.
In part 2, I mentioned that the plot of this episode is taking some clear inspiration from the Holmes novel, The Valley of Fear. Valley comes up in a lot of Series 4 meta discussions, which is why I finally read it in the research stage for this project. It mostly comes up in the context of John Douglas as a mirror character for our John, which I agree with, but I think the influence of The Valley of Fear goes much deeper than that. Spoiler warning for The Valley of Fear, which does have some genuinely good twists worth experiencing for yourself. If you don't want it spoiled for you, all you need to know is that Bertie Edwards had a secret plan. Skip ahead to this time if you don't want to know more. The second half of the novel is the story of a man, McMurdo, who the careful reader will immediately know is a younger version of a character we've already met, going by a different name. He moves to Vermissa, an area known locally as the Valley of Fear, because of the actions of the Scours, a branch of the Freemen terrorizing everyone in the valley. Some police listening in on McMurdo's conversation on the train to Vermissa warn McMurdo, who is a member of the Freemen elsewhere, not to get involved here. McMurdo lashes out, telling them to mind their business. We quickly learn that he has a criminal record and may have blood on his hands, but he's also full of contradictions. He quickly falls in love with a woman and treats her kindly, and avoids reporting to the Scours leader, Bodymaster McGinty, far longer than he should according to protocol. Eventually, he does go to meet him, picking a fight with McGinty in the process, but then eventually joins the Scours. From that point forward, McMurdo takes part in some truly heinous actions, from beating an old man to blowing up a thankfully vacated home. Because we know who McMurdo later turns out to be, the reader is left wondering why he's doing all of this. Does he have a change of heart later? Or is there more to this story than meets the eye? McMurdo quickly raises through the ranks of the Scours, and one of the members brings him some worrying news. There's a Pinkerton in town by the name of Bertie Edwards, sent to break up the gang. McMurdo promises to take care of it, and takes the news to Bodymaster McGinty. McMurdo proposes that he'll lead Bertie Edwards to his home, where McGinty and the members he trusts most will be waiting, and they can torture him for information before killing him to send a message. McGinty agrees, and so later that night, the Scours are hidden, laughing and drinking, when McMurdo comes into the room. He came to the end of the table and looked round at them. A subtle change had come over him. His manner was of one who had great work to do. His face had set into granite firmness. His eyes shone with fierce excitement behind his spectacles. He had become a visible leader of men. They stared at him with eager interest, but he said nothing. Still with the same singular gaze, he looked from man to man. "Well?" cried Boss McGinty at last. "Is he here? Is Bertie Edwards here?" "Yes," McMurdo answered slowly. Bertie Edwards is here. I am Bertie Edwards. The room falls silent, except for the sound of a kettle hissing, sharp and strident to the ear. Then a sudden shattering of glass. The officers who had surrounded the house spring into action, and the Scours are subdued. And we get what might be my favorite moment of the Holmes canon, Bertie Edwards' victory speech. All along, he had been working tirelessly to dismantle their organization from the inside, had done what he could to thwart their plans. He had stayed the hand of the attacker who was going to kill the old man. He had warned the family to flee before he blew up the house. And I think the exact wording of this speech might be very relevant to BBC Sherlock. You know me now for what I am. At last I can put my cards on the table. I am Bertie Edwards of the Pinkertons. I was chosen to break up your gang. I had a hard and dangerous game to play. Not a soul, not one soul, not my nearest and dearest knew that I was playing it. But it's over tonight, thank God, and I am the winner. Maybe they will say that I was as bad as you. They can say what they like, so long as I get you. It would not surprise me if this is how Mark and Stephen view their own work. Two men with a hard and dangerous game to play that no one can know that they're playing, and maybe people will say they are as bad as the rest in the end, but that doesn't matter to them, so long as they get this story told, the moment where the glass is shattered. I would point out that from where I stand, there doesn't appear to be a force that they're fighting against, that this game is being played for the game's own sake. And so casting themselves as heroes for what they're doing is a bit much. Then again, that hero is a Pinkerton. Not that Mark and Stephen are that bad. The Valley of Fear opens and closes, with Holmes receiving 2 letters. The first comes from a double agent working for Moriarty, a man named Porlock, who gets a brief mention in The Six Thatchers.
Only those within this room, code names Antarctica, Langdale, Porlock and Love, will ever know the whole truth.
Porlock's coded letter is a warning that Moriarty is planning to kill the man you know as Bertie Edwards. The second letter, at the end of the novel, comes from Moriarty himself, only 6 words long. Dear me, Mr. Holmes, dear me. Holmes instantly understands the message. Moriarty has succeeded. Bertie Edwards is dead. And if Doyle was being deliberate and clever with how he used Moriarty, there's a lot you can read into Holmes' explanation of what happened. Bertie Edwards, like Jefferson Hope in A Study in Scarlet, is another man who could not be with the person he loved, or could not be with them for long, because of the society around him. You can tell an old master by the sweep of his brush. I can tell a Moriarty when I see one. It is done by a man who cannot afford to fail, one whose whole unique position depends on the fact that all he does must succeed. Do not tell me we have to sit down under this. Do you say that no one can ever get level with this King Devil? No, I don't say that, said Holmes, and his eyes seemed to be looking far into the future. I don't say that he can't be beat, but you must give me time. You must give me time. We all sat in silence for some minutes, while those fateful eyes still strained to pierce the veil. The Valley of Fear was published after The Final Problem, and so in this moment, Holmes seems to know how things will unfold with Moriarty, how they are fated to end. He and Moriarty going over together. It has to be together, doesn't it? At the end...
It's always just you! Not me!
Well, there's that idea of an inescapable destiny that's all over BBC Sherlock in its last 4 episodes. And the line about Holmes staring off into the unknown future certainly seems familiar.
But then I've always known I was a man out of his time.
So these references seem to suggest that BBC Sherlock is a story where Holmes will finally defeat that King Devil. But it's a different Mr. Holmes, the one standing in for the writers. The first direct hint of M-theory in the plot of the show is Mycroft giving Sherlock the case of the Bruce Partington plans immediately after Moriarty launches his game, a case which is named for Mark's favorite Holmes story, one that involves Mycroft coming to call about missing submarine plans and a body found near train tracks. The second half of The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes is very loosely based on this story, and I don't want to get too off the rails by analyzing Private Life, but I do want to highlight one particular idea that I presented in my analysis of the film. The writers have admitted that they lifted Mycroft's characterization directly from Private Life.
I mean, Christopher Lee's Mycroft, though, is directly why my Mycroft is like that, because it felt to us that what Wilder was doing was taking a sort of one-joke character and making it more sophisticated, really. And the idea of M being Mycroft being / Moriarty and everything, it's really wonderfully done there.
And I've always wondered if that's true of his thematic role too. I think you can easily read what ultimately happens to Mycroft's submersible as Billy Wilder commenting on his original intent for the film, that he wasn't able to tell the story the way he wanted. All of his effort was for nothing.
Mr. Holmes, we are not amused. It is unsportsmanlike, it is un-English, and it is in very poor taste. We will have none of it. Get rid of it. Scuttle it. The sooner the better.
What a shame. All that superb engineering and all that cunning espionage for naught.
In a last-ditch effort to get some use out of the submersible, Mycroft decides to let the enemy spies have it.
Invite them aboard for the final journey. 700 feet. Straight down.
This first proper attempt to adapt Holmes as a love story after the original was a failure, and it wasn't just left sitting in a castle. Jonah sank in deep waters.
When does the path we walk on lock around our feet?
The roads we walk have demons beneath.
When does the road become a river with only one destination?
And yours have been waiting for a very long time.
Death waits for us all in Samara.
Deep water, Sherlock, all your life, in all your dreams. Deep waters.
But can Samara be avoided?
That is the fate that BBC Sherlock is trying to avoid. If the writers rewrote Series 1, knowing what they wanted the story to become, a 5-act narrative slowly unveiling the suppressed love story to the world, then the pool scene at the end of The Great Game is the last true moment of uncertainty. This is the only time the writers admit that they weren't sure if they would be able to continue. And so, at the end of The Great Game, an episode which constantly raises questions about what this story seeks to accomplish, practically screaming at the audience that this show is the writers trying to play the game on a grand scale, they ended with Sherlock and John locked in a silent standoff with Moriarty and all he represents, and leave the audience questioning if or how they would be able to escape. Will this be the same story all over again? Or are we dealing with something new? Perhaps something new. But in Series 2, the writers are quick to acknowledge that theirs is hardly the first attempt to tell this version. And so we get a remake of The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, where the writers praise audiences who try to understand the themes of their favorite stories, just like they themselves have always done, but also hiding a warning of what was to come with those same characters. And like Billy Wilder before them, they include hints of their plan for their story within the text itself.
Bond Air is go. That's decided. Check with the Coventry lot.
This is another idea that I've shared before, that Bond Air is a symbol for their story and what they plan to do with it, that they will let their opponents think they've won before they reveal the grand plan, just like Bertie Edwards. Back then, I thought this was only about the way they lie in interviews, but if Series 4, or a version of it, was in the works all along, well, this reading also slots perfectly into the final problem. There is a code, one that the writers are aware of and are using, but they're making it look as if there isn't.
What's Coventry got to do with anything?
It's a story, probably not true. In the Second World War, the Allies knew that Coventry was going to get bombed because they'd broken the German code, but they didn't want the Germans to know that they'd broken the code, so they let it happen anyway.
Which explains why we get the callback to Bond Air in The Final Problem. The episode The Final Problem is the real Bond Air.
The Coventry Conundrum. What do you think of my solution? The flight of the dead.
Help me, please. I'm on a plane. Everyone's asleep.
Plane blows up mid-air. Mission accomplished for the terrorists. Hundreds of casualties, but nobody dies.
I'm trying to solve a puzzle.
What about the plane?
Well, the puzzle will save the plane.
Neat, don't you think?
And I'll point out that if we're paying attention to parallel structure, A Scandal in Belgravia and The Final Problem are each other's mirror points. So that checks out. The aforementioned Dear Me, Mr. Holmes, Dear Me text that Mycroft receives from Moriarty comes when Moriarty has discovered his Coventry plan, when it looks like the game is up. that this story really is going to go the way of Private Life. They will never get their grand Bertie Edwards reveal because Moriarty has gotten a hold of his plan too early. And you can see when combining these scenes that this metaphor is being tied back to the submersible in Private Life, with references to the plane crashing into the sea.
How's the plane going to fly, of course? Unmanned aircraft, hardly new.
She's about to fly over a city in a pilotless plane. We'll have to talk her through it. It has to crash in the sea. It doesn't fly. It will never fly. This entire project is cancelled. We can't fool them now. We've lost everything. What about the girl? Well, obviously, Dr. Watson, she's the one who's going to crash it. No, we could help her land it. And if we fail, she crashes into a city. How many will die then? How are we going to get her to do that? I'm afraid we're going to have to give her hope.
I think this is the writers explaining why they think the deception is so important to what they're trying to do. That they're attempting to make a grand point, to make people realize that deep down, they want the story to be about John and Sherlock's relationship. The scene on Bond Air even includes a description of what we're in for over the course of the story's 5 acts.
Are you really so obvious? Because this was textbook. The promise of love, the pain of loss, the joy of redemption. Then give him a puzzle and watch him dance.
Series 4 is quite the puzzle, but maybe we'll get to have a celebratory dance in the end. Here, because the secret has gotten out too soon, it looks like the plans are dashed, and the romance will forever be left unspoken. But Stephen fixed the ending of Private Life in more ways than one. The most critical change in this discussion is that Sherlock rectifies his mistake in time, and Mycroft is given more than enough information to continue his work.
Hope the contents make up for any inconvenience I may have caused you tonight.
I'm certain they will.
You just went the wrong way last time, that's all. This time, get it right.
In hindsight, the Reichenbach fall is just 90 minutes of red flags. The entire episode centers around Moriarty deliberately ruining Sherlock's reputation, and Sherlock ultimately going along with it because he feels he has no other choice. And of course, that's Mycroft's idea.
Actually, that was mostly Mycroft's idea.
Oh, so it's your brother's plan?
I'm a fake.
Sherlock.
The newspapers were right all along.
The episode shows that these writers are very aware of how easy it is to convince people a lie is the truth, that they use that to their advantage.
Everybody wants to believe it. That's what makes it so clever. A lie that's preferable to the truth. That's what you do when you sell a big lie. You wrap it up in a truth to make it more palatable.
And again, Moriarty is only able to sell this lie because of Mycroft.
So, one big lie. Sherlock's a fraud. But people will swallow it because the rest of it's true. I'm sorry. Tell him, would you?
To say nothing of the way that the story of Sir Boast-a-Lot sounds exactly like it could have been written about the writers by any ex-Sherlock fan in the aftermath of The Final Problem.
Are Sir Boast-a-Lot's stories even true? He's just a big old liar who makes things up to make himself look good.
Or the blatant acknowledgement that the writers know what they did with Moriarty in The Final Problem would be a disappointment.
So this is the story that you're going to publish. The big conclusion of it all. Moriarty's an actor?
Clever, Eurus. You go, girl.
And to crown it all off, there are constant reminders that we know what the final problem will be, and a warning that none of that will be addressed in the episode bearing that name. At least, not on the surface.
So how are you going to do it? Burn me.
I will burn the heart out of you.
What's the problem? The final problem. Have you worked out what it is yet? What's the final problem? I did tell you. But did you listen?
What is it all for?
We were made for each other, Sherlock.
I want to solve the problem. Our problem.
The final problem.
Hello. My name's Jim Moriarty.
Hello. Are you ready for the story?
Welcome to the final problem.
You and me, Sherlock. And our problem, the final problem. Staying alive. It's so boring, isn't it?
Sweet Jim, he was never very interested in being alive, especially if it could make more trouble being dead.
But that wasn't the end of Sir Boast-a-Lot's problem. No, that wasn't the final problem.
And of course, there are the ways that Anderson doesn't just mirror the experience of fans obsessing over Reichenbach solutions, he's a bit of foreshadowing too.
Do you honestly believe that if you have enough stupid theories, it's going to change what really happened?
I believe in Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, well, that won't bring him back.
Like with Agatha in the convent, I'm pretty sure I lived through this one. Like, I don't want to get into detail, but I had the full post-Reichenbach experience, guys. Negative experiences with the press and all. The Empty Hearse is the first episode to take place after Moriarty is dead, but his fingerprints are still all over the narrative. Messages asking Mary to choose between John or James. A silent Miranda surrounded by elephants to make us look for the real one. John being stuffed into a fire in order to use Sherlock's pressure points against him.
Very hard to find a pressure point on you, Mr. Holmes.
And every person has their pressure point.
So how are you going to do it? Burn me. Well, look how you care about John Watson. Your damsel in distress.
It's a very obvious posthumous game he's playing in Series 3. The central plot of The Empty Hearse, as you all know, involves that underground bomb, hidden on tracks laid a century ago, that don't show up on any map, but are there if you know where to look for them.
You mentioned Sumatra Road, Mr. Holmes. There was a station down there.
Well, why isn't it on the maps?
Because it was closed before it ever opened. It all got tied up in legal disputes, so they never built the station on the surface.
It's here that we get that heart bomb that has not yet gone off, and a near confession in a train carriage.
Sorry, I can't do it, John. I don't know how. Another one of your bloody tricks. No. You're just trying to make me say something nice. Not this time.
If Mark and Steven wrote Sherlock because they wanted to be the first ones to tell this as a love story, not anyone else, then of course this later becomes the representation, the vehicle for how the show avoids following the path of every other Holmes adaptation. It all goes back to those conversations on the train, the idea driving them, the appointment in Sumatra.
Death waits for us all in Samara, but can Samara be avoided?
This is how we end, you and I. Always here, always together.
You wrote your own version, as I remember. Appointment in Sumatra. The merchant goes to a different city and is perfectly fine.
Sooner or later, that bomb is going to go off.
Colloquially, it is known as the patience grenade.
Sorry, yes, hello. Bit late. Trains.
Even if it takes longer than originally anticipated. Which is a perfect way to segue into Mycroft's brief appearance in The Abominable Bride, which you might have noticed now drives me up a wall. Let's start with Mark wearing a fat suit, which has never been my favorite choice. Yes, it's a callback to the canon, it's an unnecessary one, but I think they might have had a point with it. Not a very well-made point. It's kind of in the territory of using contamination as a metaphor for queerness, but here's where I think they were going with this. If, during that rainy day, during the filming of His Last Vow, Mark and Steven really did plot out The Abominable Bride, Series 4 and Series 5, they probably knew that they had gone a bit over the top. That this plan was a bit overindulgent. And maybe even a bit heartless.
Well, now you mention it, this level of consumption is incredibly injurious to your health. Your heart.
No need to worry on that score, Watson.
No?
There's only a large cavity where that organ should reside.
But they went ahead anyway, content to risk their reputations to make a point.
You're gambling with your own life.
Why not? It's so much more exciting than gambling with others.
Of course, it's not quite that clear-cut. The fans who've picked up on the themes that this story is borrowing from private life, they'd like to have a word about this.
Thank you, Wilder.
Also, Mr. Mellis to see you, Mr. Holmes.
Give me 5 minutes. I have a wager to win. Better make that 15.
They're going to end up waiting a little longer than they thought.
It's getting exciting now. Tick-tock, tick-tock.
This scene is a subtle warning, because the creators of Chris Mellis's favorite comic series started making the events of the story happen in real life around him as a publicity stunt. Kind of like how the release of The Final Problem mirrors what happened in the plot of the Reichenbach Fall. This episode does also have some subtextual reassurance too, the brides who must win. Then again, they seem to acknowledge now that they have trapped their gender-neutral brides in boxes, fed them nothing but scraps, psychologically tormented and gaslit them, and have unnecessarily drawn out their suffering.
This room is full of brides.
Right.
brides, yes, I think that's the right word for it.
The women we have lied to, betrayed.
Tell him I'm hungry. He only gives me scraps.
You took everything from me. Well, of course I did. I've been making you last.
Again, it seems like they may have undergone some self-reflection in the years since writing The Final Problem. I do also enjoy that the entirety of The Abominable Bride takes place on a plane. That John and Mycroft's entire plan for how to save Sherlock is to put him on a plane and then land that plane safely at home.
We've landed, sir. We've landed.
That might be the in-universe reason for why John writes the climax of this story the way he does. He was trying to get it right with this, and it didn't quite work. There are plenty of these meta elements still at work in Series 4 once you go back to look for them. Like I mentioned in a previous video, perhaps Moriarty taking over all of British television should have been more of a red flag for what we were in for. That certainly seems to be the implication from the opening scene of The Six Thatchers, with a true version of events that must remain classified for 100 years, and the official version Mycroft, Mark, plans to present is equated with Moriarty taking over the TVs.
That's not what happened at all.
It is now.
If James Moriarty can hack every TV screen in the land, rest assured we have the tech to doctor a bit of security footage. That is now the official version.
Because Series 4 is what happens when you let Moriarty run the story, you see. This is a home story told wrong. Mycroft does almost nothing this series but lurk around and make meta references. From the aforementioned scene about an untrue official version, to Sherlock's appointment in Sumatra, to...
Oh, good. I love an acronym. All the best secret societies have them. I don't like loose ends. Not on my watch.
Yeah, I still want to bop this. There's a subtler bit where Mycroft tells Sherlock that if he wants to accuse the whole plot of the episode of being about love, he had better be sure.
A mo, a mass, a mat.
I love, you love, he loves. What?
Not ammo is in ammunition, but a mo meaning...
You'd better be right, Sherlock.
You unlocked the gate and you weren't sure.
It looks like Sherlock was wrong initially, but he wasn't. Not entirely. It's just not playing out quite like he expected. In episode 2, Mycroft tracks Sherlock using his phone and wonders aloud why Sherlock has gone off the rails. The answer, of course, is John.
I'm trying to establish exactly what drove Sherlock off the rails. Any ideas?
What does he do with anything he can't answer, John, every time?
He stabs it.
Save him.
This is perhaps the most pointed hint that Series 4 is like this, because it's John's version. That's why Sherlock, BBC Sherlock, has gone off the rails. This is the scene where Yorick is just gone, by the way. The one where the writer is asking what this show is actually about, why these events are unfolding at all. The Lying Detective centers around yet another evil media figure, Culverton Smith. We've already talked about the implications his characterization has for the way John views himself, but this does also seem to be a bit of a reflection on how people in positions of power or influence are often given the benefit of the doubt. A few of the moments with Culverton do seem like a bit of pointed commentary on what they're doing with this series.
Has it occurred to you, anywhere in your drug-addled brain, that you've just been played?
Oh, yes.
For an ad campaign.
Brilliant, isn't it? Safest place to hide. Plain sight.
There is a killer on board. In plain sight.
Tell them your darkest secret.
I love you.
Money, power, fame. Some things make you untouchable. The way in which fame and popularity and sort of self-mythologizing can make you kind of untouchable.
No one's untouchable.
In this episode, we also get Mary literally haunting John. She's the reason he feels like he can't speak.
So there is no one you talk to, confide in?
No one.
Are you going to tell her about me?
No.
She's also there in the background, insisting that Sherlock wear the deerstalker hat he hates. And Sherlock even mentions her when he does eventually put it on at the end of the episode.
You should be wearing the hat. The kids would love the hat.
Actually, he should wear the hat as a special tribute to me. I'm dead. I would really appreciate it.
Seriously?
I'm Sherlock Holmes, I wear the damn hat. Isn't that right, Mary?
And as I've already said, the way John seems to be using her in his story to either let himself or Sherlock express the things they don't to each other is a great nod to Mary Morstan's role in The Sign of the Four.
1 murder, 10 suspects.
10, yeah.
All of them guilty.
Sherlock.
All I ever wanted to do was keep you and Rosie safe, that's all.
I will keep you safe.
And we even get a hint that this John is using her this way because of his shame.
Are you disapproving face on?
Well, seeing as I'm inside your head, I think we can call that self-loathing.
While it at first appears that Series 4 focuses on all of the wrong things, that the writers think that the point is the wacky antics and the legend of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson after all, in the subtext, the thing actually driving the story forward, even now, is still the suppressed love story, as embodied in Eurus. But she's a corrupted version. She's been locked away behind glass for too long, and has fully embraced the ways that everyone misunderstands the story. She makes Sherlock's high-functioning sociopath act look tame by comparison, the ultimate satire of that reading of Holmes. She sees too much, knows too much, and that's used to turn her into a monster.
She knew things she should never have known. As if she was somehow aware of truths beyond the normal scope.
You look funny, grown-up.
But we know that deep down, she feels lost and scared and alone. But she thinks there's no more hope for her. Not without Sherlock, the character, and the show. For Sherlock to help her, he first has to understand what she's been through. We'll see that come out in her games. The final problem opens with Mycroft watching a black and white detective film that's actually about romance. Sherlock and John use this film, their knowledge that Mycroft adores it, knows all the words and lovingly mouths along, to get him to confess to the existence of Eurus, the untold story. It works like a charm.
Oh, I hope we didn't spoil your enjoyment of the movie.
The other thing we must mention, because it's absolutely key for us, is the Billy Wilder film, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which is a masterpiece and, in so many ways, is tonally what we're trying to do. There are a lot of things that we've taken from that, and we can't say what they all are. Mycroft is terrified of the possibility that Eurus has gotten out of Sharonford without his knowledge.
In short, if I find any indication my sister has left this island at any time, I swear to you, you will not.
In fact, Mycroft is the only one who even knows that Eurus is still alive, picking up the work where the heavily implied to be queer Uncle Rudy left off.
Uncle Rudy took care of things.
Where is she, Mycroft? Where's our sister?
There's a place called Sharonford.
Once Eurus proves that she has gotten out, using Mycroft's own patience grenade against him, well, he takes some extreme lengths to ensure she remains locked away, going so far as to make it look like he might die from that explosion, and wearing silly costumes. And all of this is justified in his mind.
This is insane. This is unnecessary.
No, your security is compromised and we don't know who to trust.
And that justifies dressing up.
Yes, it does!
Yeah, you would say that, wouldn't you? Of course, what's actually happening here is that Mycroft was using himself as a distraction so that Sherlock would have the chance to meet Eurus.
But that is sort of the point, isn't it? See, you should have been looking at the guy you just gave your pass to.
With this reading, even the scene I initially hated the most, Eurus's trick with the glass, is actually sort of reassuring. The focus isn't that Sherlock missed that there was nothing to see through, it's that the glass keeping Eurus imprisoned is gone. That, in fact, she could have gotten out at any time, she was just waiting for the right person to reach out to her.
You think it's a trick? You look so unsure. You're not used to being unsure, are you? The man who sees through everything is exactly the man who doesn't notice when there's nothing to see through.
But of course, she puts the glass back in place to trap Sherlock, John, and Mycroft in the walls of Sharonford. All throughout this horror show, Eurus and Moriarty talk to the characters through TV screens, calling back to the end of the last series, and subtly reminding us that this is still all Moriarty's version. Because while this episode fails to deliver on any of the foreshadowed plot lines related to his character, the final problem is the embodiment of everything Moriarty wanted to do thematically. Suppress the romance, thwart Mycroft's efforts,
And here we are. The end of the line. Holmes killing Holmes. This is where I get off.
and use his knowledge of Sherlock to tell his version of the story. He does love doing that.
Unless I kill myself, complete your story.
You gotta admit that's sexier.
He recorded lots of little messages for me before he died. Loved it.
Did you know his brother was a station master? I think he was always jealous.
Ah yes, James Moriarty's station master brother, James Moriarty. Even that is a potential tell that he's not dead. That's how I read it in the stories too. Like, yes, hello, I am James Moriarty, and I would like to publicly clear the name of James Moriarty. Some relation, but we are definitely different people, for sure. Also notable is the double meaning of station master there. Eurus seems to be implying that this is in relation to TV stations, but the term is generally used for a train station master, as it was in the Valley of Fear, of course. The clearest statement of what's going on here thematically comes from Eurus.
Sweet Jim, he was never very interested in being alive, especially if it could make more trouble being dead.
Yet still not interested. The plane!
You knew he'd take his revenge. His revenge, apparently, is me.
I suspect this is why Moriarty being dead is the only thing the writers state consistently, along with the fact that John and Sherlock will never fall in love. The two ideas sort of go hand in hand. We've seen throughout this retrospective that there are so many choices relating to his character that hint at so much promise, reveal the threads of so much careful planning on the part of the writers, but they want to make you doubt that, too. Moriarty's greatest trick, like the devil he's so often compared to, is making you think that he doesn't exist. Because if none of the planning with him was intentional, well, the rest of the tricks Series 4 is trying to pull become much more believable. And again, it goes back to the Reichenbach fall. His ultimate goal in that episode was to convince the world that there never was any James Moriarty. Everything relating to him was a lie Sherlock was telling, the writers trying to make themselves look clever.
Did you almost start to wonder if I was real? Did I nearly get you?
It's a much more convincing lie in Series 4 than it was in Series 3. Moriarty's ultimate revenge, in the meta sense, is turning the untold story itself into an antagonist. Again, a plan enabled by Mycroft, because that's what the writers have done with the show. Turned this story into a game. As much as the narrative final problem has been set up to involve Moriarty, falls, fairy tales, and burning out Sherlock's heart, and I still hold out some hope that all of those things might come together in a potential Series 5, the final problem thematically is finally telling the love story. And the only reason it hasn't been told at this point is Mark and Stephen. And so Eurus takes her revenge by putting Mycroft, Sherlock, and John into her prison and making them play her games, with the ultimate goal of getting Sherlock to understand her. Eurus's games are all focused on scenarios that would spell failure for the show's ultimate goal, mirrored versions of how the story might go wrong based on what's been set up so far. These are familiar ideas. Game 1. John is asked to shoot someone to save a Sherlock mirror, but he can't go through with it. The John mirror sacrifices himself, but it's not enough. Whatever John does, they both die, and their love story ends in tragedy. Game 2. You wanted Garadebs. Here they are, dangling over the sea. What do you mean that's not what you meant? That's all there ever was to this story, just a silly reference. There was no genuine display of affection, no depth of loyalty and love, no moment of revelation. Game 3. That bomb that never went off? Your appointment in Sumatra? Not only is it twisted into a love confession to the wrong person, Eurus reveals there never was a bomb. You're waiting for nothing. Game 4. The best written scene in Series 4, where the writer proxy talks about how they have to sacrifice John in a series where they have done just that to his character. But it's a ploy. He knows this story needs John. That's the point. Sherlock, the show, attempts suicide as John and Mycroft blandly watch on, because they're the two telling the story that makes it look like the show has died. But Eurus can't let that happen. She doesn't want to kill Sherlock. She wants Sherlock to understand her, to save her, which of course leads to Eurus's final game.
At long last, Sherlock Holmes, it's time to solve the Musgrave ritual. Your very first case.
And the final problem?
Symbolically, this final game is very revealing. The final problem and the trauma haunting Sherlock Holmes since he was first created are one and the same. The true story has not been told, could not be told. That's what has shaped this version of Sherlock, this adaptation, because the writers wanted to emphasize that this was the first version to tell Holmes' story properly, to use that as an opportunity to recreate the game in spectacular fashion one last time. This version of Sherlock could have been happy all along, just as he was as a child. But because of that history, the untold story, enabled by the writers, takes one final bit of revenge by making this version of Sherlock and John truly suffer before they can get to their happy ending. That's the demon that has been haunting this narrative all along.
I never had a best friend. I had no one.
In this reveal about Victor Trevor, we get a callback to my two favorite scenes that take place in universe: the pool scene and the waterfall scene. And on the surface, it seems like the show is trying to convince you that those scenes were really about the drowned Victor Trevor, but I think it might just be the other way around. It's a hint that this drowned boy, like the submersible lost in Loch Ness, really ties back to the thematic messages those scenes were getting at, that this is a story that has gone the same way every time.
Everything I have to say has already crossed your mind.
Probably my answers crossed yours.
It has to be together, doesn't it? At the end, it's always just you and me!
But we already know that this time, things are going to end differently.
Do you mind if I get that?
Sherlock eventually gets the message.
I am lost without your love. Save my soul. Seek my room.
He realizes what Eurus is actually after. Someone to finally play the game and get it right.
You're playing with me, Sherlock. We're playing the game.
The game, yes, I get it now.
Here at the end, we come back to our central idea, the Coventry Conundrum. How to make it look like you've lost the battle when you plan to win the war. Again, landing Eurus's plane, unveiling the romance, is, thematically, the final problem. That's what this story exists to do, because this story couldn't be told on its own.
Your mind has created the perfect metaphor. You're high above us all, alone in the sky, and you understand everything except how to land.
Sherlock, the show, insists that in spite of his faults, he'll be able to do what no one else has managed.
Now, I'm just an idiot. I'm on the ground. I can bring you home.
Eurus fears that it will be a wasted effort.
It's too late now.
It's not too late.
I'm lost in the sky, and no one can hear me.
But she's wrong. This time, things will end differently.
You just went the wrong way last time, that's all. This time, get it right. Help me save John Watson.
Not only do I suspect that's foreshadowing for the eventual climax, we've seen throughout this retrospective that this is one of the major differences in this version, that these writers recognize John Watson's importance to the narrative. Even in this series, where they initially appear to have lost sight of who John is, in this reading, that's part of the commentary on John's role as an unreliable narrator, the way he downplays his own contributions, and the story being ruined when John isn't valued is part of the point. They know this story needs John Watson. Maybe even in a way private life didn't. After all, Wilder only alluded to wanting to have Holmes be in love with Watson, not the other way around. There's a potential hint in The Abominable Bride that these writers think Wilder might not have understood Watson as well as he understood Holmes. At the end of Series 4, Sherlock still can't bring Eurus home. Yet. Although he can at least get Mycroft out of the glass cell where Eurus locked him for revenge. How appropriate.
He's a bit shaken up, that's all. She didn't hurt him, she just locked him in her old cell.
What goes around comes around.
But what this episode does, what this show has done, is provide context for her story, demonstrating through these allegorical characters why it hasn't been told yet, and turning the journey of finally telling it into its own elaborate narrative.
I said I'd bring her home. Can't, can I?
Well, you gave her what she was looking for. Context.
For now, Eurus goes back to her glass cell, but now Sherlock visits her in Sharonford, and they seem to understand each other through their playing. As Mary, the character introduced to the home stories to suppress the romance, tells us that once she's gone, she knows what Sherlock and John could become.
And if I'm gone, I know what you could become. because I know who you really are.
But does her best to convince the audience that doesn't matter. It's only ever been about the legend. We see this wordless conversation between Sherlock and Eurus continue, reminding us that this version of Sherlock is still playing Eurus's game, and he's already won it. In the final shot, Sherlock and John dash out of Rathbone Place, the last adaptation to bring Sherlock Holmes into the modern day, and leap out towards the future, but find themselves frozen in time. All of that symbolism gives this otherwise disheartening montage a sense of hope, even without the post-credits reminder of Moriarty's lingering presence. Hidden in the ending are little hints that, though the wait might be long, we all have an appointment waiting for us in Sumatra. Right now, we find ourselves stuck in the Coventry Conundrum, where it looks as if the game has been lost, that there never was a game to begin with. But maybe that won't be the case forever. Perhaps one day, Bond Air will fly, and rather than crashing into the sea, it will land home safely at last. Perhaps after 100 years underwater, Count Dracula's ship will reach English soil, and he'll finally come out into the sunlight. Perhaps there will be a sudden shattering of glass, and the ones playing a hard and dangerous game will reveal themselves for what they always were. Perhaps, in the end, after over a century of silence, the suppressed romance, the true story, will be told. Or perhaps not. Well, that last bit, someone is going to do it. Whether or not it's these guys is up to them. I do think it's their loss if they don't, but at the end of the day, this is their story to tell as they like, just as they always do. Looking back at this story in retrospect, I see more reasons than ever to think that BBC Sherlock is a much more carefully crafted work than it would first appear. That these writers took everything they loved about the Holmes stories, including the frustrating, contradictory bits that you really have to engage with in order to get around, and painstakingly recreated all of it in their version. A show hoping to make a grand statement. To finally answer that question underpinning everything else, what were the Holmes stories truly about, with the only remaining answer: the desperately unspoken love between Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. And I still find that message profound and beautiful, and appreciate the care that's gone into emphasizing this version as the first to get it right with all due fanfare, even as a large part of me wishes that they had gone about it differently. But I still don't know what will happen with BBC Sherlock. Maybe it will never come out again. Maybe it will be the horrible version that I narrated at the start of this video. Or maybe one day, the writers will make good on the promises in both Sherlock and Dracula, and I'll be back to officially round out the channel with an episode 50. Whatever happens, I think I'll be okay. I don't need their story anymore. It would be nice if we turned out to be right, and I'm sure I will watch the John Locke kiss on a loop if and when it does happen. And again, if John gets stabbed in the heart in the Gyrodebs moment, I will literally never shut up about it. But I'm not here to convince myself or you that it's going to happen. That's not what I need to believe in to find hope and purpose anymore. But I did need to revisit this show to rediscover those things. Not really because I needed to learn to love this show again, although I'm glad that I have, but because I needed to re-examine the story that I had told myself about what had happened here. I went to some very dark places those first few months after Series 4, and while I never got close to acting on the darkest of those thoughts, for a long time, for almost 5 years, it was like part of me had died. I locked it away because I was terrified of what I would see if I let it out. For a long time, I believed that my time with Sherlock and TJLC had proven that I was cursed, that I would only ever hurt those I loved, that I would disappoint anyone that ever looked to me, that the things that I had thought were my talents, my strengths, my passions, my loves, were actually weapons that wouldn't just destroy my life, but everyone else's too if I let them. And if I thought I had understood things about myself because of this show, and I had gotten the show so laughably wrong, then I must have been making up those things about myself too. I was a fake. I was a fraud. And so I lived my life in a sort of mental lockdown for 5 years. If you had asked me any time after fall of 2017 if I was happy, I would have told you yes and meant it. But I kept my interest shallow, and I did not go anywhere near the things that make me feel most happy and fulfilled, because the mere thought of them terrified me. I was carrying such a crushing weight for so long. And the saddest part is that I couldn't even feel it anymore. I thought that was just how I was after this experience, who I was going to be forever, that those were the consequences of my actions. I have never been happier to be wrong. Yes, the fallout of Series 4 was a disaster. And yes, I do still wish, even now, that I could go back and approach my work differently, that I could have encouraged you to guard your heart from the beginning. But I've also discovered that I was not everything that I was afraid I was, that I was right about some things, that I didn't pull this story out of thin air, that it had, and still has, the potential to be meaningful. If TJLC Explained was a mistake, it was an earnest one. As I have endeavored to understand and forgive the writers, regardless of what their motivations might have been, I have also tried to learn to forgive the 22-year-old me who just wanted to give others hope. In many ways, that's what I still want. But I've learned that placing all of your hopes on the outcome of a TV show is perhaps not the best way to go about things. But I do draw reassurance from this experience. I thought this would destroy me. At first, quite literally, and then, for a long time, that I would live the rest of my life being permanently damaged by what had happened. That wasn't true. And the fact that I could come back to this story and rediscover love and joy and light in something that I was sure had ruined me, I find that tremendously encouraging. Maybe nothing is ruined forever. Maybe we can find beauty and meaning even where we least expect it. Whatever lies behind the cold masks of Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, it was worth a wound to discover that I could heal from it in the end. That was the real revelation. After years of telling myself that I was never going to give this show or its writers another instant of my time, I have spent the last several months dedicated to analyzing this story again, trying to make peace with what happened here. I didn't do it for them. I did it for myself, and I did it for all of you. As terrified as I was to make that choice, I am so glad I did, because I didn't realize how badly I needed to heal from this until the pain was finally gone. I feel happy and whole in a way I never thought I would again. Maybe you did the same thing. Told yourself that your time in TJLC was going to be a source of pain for the rest of your life, that you would just have to deal with or repress. But that wasn't true either. You can find hope and beauty and significance in this, whatever that looks like for you. I hope this retrospective and From a Drop of Water have helped, that your journey through this will be much smoother than mine was. If I helped you fall into the pit to begin with, I wanted to do everything in my power to make it easier to climb out. But that's ultimately all I can do. Bring you back to the point where we all left off 5 years ago, but hopefully a little wiser and less dependent on the actions of creators. What happens now is up to you, and I don't think there is one right answer. Revisit the show or don't. Engage with TJLC or don't. Love the first 10 episodes or the first 6 or just The Abominable Bride or none of them. Find another story. Become the world's biggest fan of BBC Dracula, although if you try to go that route, you'll have some very healthy competition. Or get into Black Sails, or Disco Elysium, or Pathologic 2, or the Matrix movies, or anything else that captures the same joy that you had in this. Whatever you do, don't bury those pieces of yourself. Your talents, your love for literary analysis, or for these characters, for their story and its various iterations, your own identity and the things this version revealed about who you really are, out of shame. I understand why you might have made that choice. Believe me, I do. But you're only hurting yourself in the long run. You were upset, and you told yourself what you needed to believe in order to survive. That there was nothing good to be found here, that it was all better left forgotten. That story, while pure and simple, was not entirely true. It's been 5 years now. You've spent enough time surviving. It's time you lived again. Face what happened without fear, knowing that what you discover will not destroy you. You are the only one who can make that choice, which is daunting, I know, but hopefully it's also inspiring. You never needed them, and you never needed me. Although if this has helped you in any way, then I'm very grateful for that. But what you needed was always closer than you thought. It wasn't in this show or beholden to another person's actions. To paraphrase the wonderful song Stagnite by Betty and Mars, and my dear friend Lid's own paraphrase of it, you thought you were looking at the light, but the light was inside you all along. The love, the joy, the creativity, the friendships, the self-discovery, those were all just as real as the pain and regret. I hope you'll come to see that those bits of good are the experiences that matter most. You can find something worthwhile in this, and I encourage you to try. BBC Sherlock and TJLC weren't all we hoped they would be, but that doesn't mean either is irredeemable. And neither are you. You don't need to believe that only the worst bits mattered anymore. Search out the good that was there all along and tell yourself a better story. Thank you all for being a part of mine.